Somewhere in Spain, in a parish church that smelled of wax and old stone, a man climbed a ladder with a folded yellow sack under his arm. His job was maintenance. The sack was a garment, a rough tunic painted with red crosses, and it had a name written across it, along with a crime and a date. The one already hanging on the wall had rotted. Damp does that to cloth, even indoors, even in Spain. So he took the old one down, hung the fresh copy in its place, and climbed back down, and the name stayed exactly where it had been for the last 100 years, in full view of everyone who came to Mass. The person who had once worn that garment was long dead. Their children were dead. In some churches, their great-grandchildren were sitting in the pews below, and every Sunday they filed past their own family name hanging on the wall of God's house, painted on a penitential sack, announcing to the whole town what their ancestor had confessed to under torture a century before. The Inquisition paid men to keep those garments legible. When one faded, it was renewed. When one fell apart, it was replaced. A church in Palma de Mallorca kept its collection visible for so long that the surnames on the sacks became a caste marker, and the families carrying those names were still being refused marriages and shut out of neighborhoods deep into the 20th century. An instruction from 1561 spelled the purpose out in plain administrative language. The garments were to hang in the churches where the condemned used to live, so that the infamy of the heretics and their descendants would be remembered forever. Forever is a strong word for a bureaucracy to use. This one meant it. Before we go any deeper into this, a quick pause for the housekeeping. Welcome in, whether you're brand new here or you've been around for a while. If you're listening to this on a commute, or doing dishes, or lying in the dark at 2 in the morning, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. The map of you all gets stranger every video, and I love it. Huge thank you to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members. You're the reason a video like this can take as long as it takes to make. If you want to join them, the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, back to Spain, and then a long way back before Spain. Because that wall of painted sacks is the finish line of a process, and the process is the actual subject of this video. Most institutions that kill people are at least in a hurry about it. This one was patient. It kept files. It employed notaries who sat in torture chambers writing down every word, every plea, every scream, in real time, in neat script, and those transcripts still exist. We can quote them. In a minute, I'm going to quote one, word for word, from a woman on a rack in Toledo in 1568, and I want you to know, going in, that nothing in it is reconstructed or dramatized. A clerk wrote it down while it happened. That, more than anything, separates the Inquisition from almost every other horror we cover on this channel. Instead of rumor filtered through enemies, a great deal of the evidence is the institution's own paperwork, produced by the institution, for the institution, describing what it did in its own proud, careful hand. The story starts about 3.5 centuries before that ladder and that yellow sack in the south of what's now France, in a stretch of country between Toulouse and the Mediterranean called the Languedoc, wine country, olive country. In the late 1100s, it was also, from Rome's point of view, infected country. The people Rome was worried about called themselves good Christians. History calls them Cathars, and their neighbors sometimes called them Albigensians, after the town of Albi. Their beliefs, as far as we can reconstruct them from hostile records and a handful of their own surviving texts, ran roughly like this: the physical world is evil. Matter itself is evil. A good God made the world of spirit, and a dark power made everything you can touch, including your own body. So the God of the Old Testament, the one who made the earth, was on the wrong team. Christ never truly took on flesh, because flesh is filth. The Catholic Church, with its gold and its land and its wine and its bishops who lived like princes, was a fraud built by the dark power to keep souls trapped in matter. You can see how that last part might have gone over. The movement had a spiritual elite called the perfecti, the perfect ones, men and women who had received a laying on of hands called the consolamentum, and afterward lived on almost nothing. No meat, no eggs, no cheese, no sex, no property worth mentioning, no lying, no oaths. Ordinary believers lived normal lives and hoped to receive the consolamentum on their deathbeds. And this made the movement doubly dangerous from the Church's perspective. The perfecti were visibly, publicly holier than the local Catholic clergy. A peasant in the Languedoc could look at a Cathar perfect who owned one robe and walked everywhere and healed the sick, and then look at his own bishop rolling past in velvet and draw his own conclusions. The nobility of the region tolerated the good Christians, protected them, in many cases were related to them. Whole towns leaned that way. The Church sent preachers, and the preachers got debated in public squares by weavers and did not always win. Rome escalated in stages. In 1184, Pope Lucius III issued a decree at Verona called Ad Abolendum, sometimes described as the founding charter of the Inquisition, ordering bishops to actively hunt for heretics in their dioceses rather than waiting for heresy to present itself. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council hardened the machinery further and wrote the duty into the general law of the Church. But the event that turned paperwork into fire happened in January of 1208 on the banks of the Rhone, when a papal legate named Pierre de Castelnau was murdered. He'd been in the region to pressure the Count of Toulouse, Raymond VI, into cracking down on the heretics on his lands, and the meeting had gone badly, with threats on both sides. The next morning, as Castelnau's party prepared to cross the river, a horseman rode up and put a lance through him. The killer was assumed, then and now, to be one of Raymond's men, whether or not Raymond ordered it. Pope Innocent III, one of the most formidable men ever to hold the office, responded by declaring a crusade against Christians, or people who at least considered themselves Christians, in the middle of Europe. Anyone who took up the cross against the Albigensians got the same spiritual rewards as a crusader to Jerusalem, plus a much shorter trip, plus the possibility of confiscated land. Knights from the north of France came south in the summer of 1209 in enormous numbers. The first major town in their path was Béziers. What happened there on the 22nd of July, 1209, comes down to us from several sources, and the most chilling one was written by the winning side. The town refused to hand over its heretics. The Catholic majority inside the walls declined to surrender their neighbors. Ordinary Catholics choosing to face a crusade rather than give up the heretics they'd grown up alongside. The assault, when it came fast. Camp followers and servants of the army stormed a gate almost by accident during a skirmish. The fighters poured in after them, and the town died in an afternoon. The papal legate travelling with the army, a Cistercian abbot named Arnaud Amalric, wrote a report to Pope Innocent shortly afterward, and his letter survives. Our men, he told the Pope, spared no one, regardless of rank or sex or age, and put to the sword almost 20,000 people. The letter is a status report, and its tone is triumph. The town was then burned, and Amalric described the divine vengeance as marvelous. You've probably heard the famous line attached to Béziers, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Supposedly Amalric said it when a soldier asked how the army was meant to tell Catholics from heretics in the chaos. The line doesn't appear in Amalric's own letter or in any eyewitness account. It shows up about a decade later in a book of moral stories compiled by a German monk named Caesarius of Heisterbach, who was careful to write that Amalric is reported to have said it. So the quote comes to us second-hand, from another country, years after the fact, with a hedge built into it by the man who wrote it down. What needs no hedge at all is the letter. Whatever Amalric said or didn't say in the moment, he told the Pope in writing that his army had killed nearly everyone in a town, sorted no one, and he framed it as a miracle. People had crowded into the churches as the sack began. The Church of Mary Magdalene was full of them, townsfolk pressed together around the altar, priests among them. Some accounts say the bells were rung until the ringers were killed. The building was set alight or its occupants were cut down inside it, depending on which account you follow, and either way, nobody walked out. The number 20,000 is probably inflated. Medieval battlefield figures usually are, and the whole town may not have held that many people, but the letter's author had no reason to exaggerate the completeness of a slaughter he was celebrating. And archaeology and every written source agree that Béziers, on that day, essentially stopped existing as a community. Word travelled ahead of the army after that. Carcassonne, the next great fortress town, held out for a couple of weeks in the August heat until the water gave out, and then surrendered on terms that give you a picture all by themselves. The entire population was allowed to leave alive, and required to leave everything. Chroniclers describe thousands of people walking out of the gates in their shirts and drawers, carrying nothing, the town behind them handed over intact, houses, furniture, food on the tables, to the crusade. The army's new military commander took possession. His name was Simon de Montfort, a minor lord from near Paris, ferociously pious, ferociously capable, and about to become the most feared man in the south for the next 9 years. De Montfort's war settled into sieges, and the sieges settled into a pattern. In the early summer of 1210, he surrounded Minerve, a village on a rock spur where 2 river gorges meet, a natural fortress with one weakness, a covered well at the base of the cliff. His engineers built a catapult the soldiers nicknamed Malvoisin, the bad neighbor, and pounded the path to the well until nobody could reach water. In the heat of a Languedoc July, that ended things. When the town surrendered, the fighting men and ordinary residents were spared. Inside, though, were about 140 Cathar perfecti, the movement's clergy, men and women. They were offered their lives if they would convert. Under the rules of the crusade, this was the standard offer, and one of the churchmen present reportedly grumbled that he hoped they'd refuse, since a forced conversion was worth nothing anyway. He needn't have worried. Contemporary accounts say a huge fire was built in the valley, and the perfecti walked into it on their own, without waiting to be pushed. A chronicler of the crusade wrote that only 3 women recanted and were pulled out. The rest, something like 140 people, burned in that gorge over the space of an afternoon. It was the first of the great mass burnings of the war, and it set the precedent that the fire, not the sword, was the proper end for a heretic. The following spring at Lavore, the pattern got worse. The town fell in May of 1211 after a hard siege, and the Crusade's fury landed on 3 separate groups. 80 knights who had defended the walls were sentenced to hang, and when the gallows collapsed under the first man, de Montfort had the rest put to the sword instead, apparently out of impatience. The lady of the town, Giralda de Laurac, widely described even by hostile sources as generous and much loved, was handed to the soldiers, thrown down a well, and buried under stones thrown in after her. And then somewhere between 300 and 400 Cathar perfecti and believers were burned together in a meadow outside the walls, the largest single burning of the entire crusade. A chronicler on the Crusader side recorded the event in a phrase that has stuck to it ever since, writing that the Crusaders burned them with immense joy. 400 human beings in one fire produces a column of smoke visible for many miles, and a smell that people who lived downwind would not have needed explained to them ever again. The war went on like that, back and forth, for another 2 decades, through the death of de Montfort, killed at the siege of Toulouse in 1218, when a stone from a catapult reportedly operated by the women and girls of the town struck him in the head, through treaties, relapses, and a slow, grinding French royal takeover of the whole region. But military force turned out to have a limitation the church hadn't fully appreciated. You can burn a town. You cannot besiege an idea. Believers went quiet, went underground, met at night, and the perfecti kept moving from farmhouse to farmhouse under cover of darkness. Killing heretics at scale had failed to kill heresy. What came next was designed to succeed where the army hadn't, and it's the actual birth of our subject. Between 1231 and 1233, Pope Gregory IX began appointing full-time professional heresy investigators answering directly to Rome, bypassing the local bishops who had proven either too lazy, too compromised, or too closely related to the suspects to do the job. He staffed the new office mostly from the Dominicans, a preaching order barely a decade old, founded specifically to argue heretics back into the fold, highly educated, owning nothing, and answerable to nobody local. The Latin word for an investigator is inquisitor. The procedure they ran was an inquisitio, an inquiry. Nobody at the time would have spoken of the Inquisition as a single organization with a headquarters and a letterhead. For most of the medieval period, it was a legal procedure and a scattering of appointed men. But those men shared manuals, shared methods, and shared an understanding of the assignment, and the assignment was to make the hiding of heresy impossible. The first generation attracted a particular type. Conrad of Marburg had already made his reputation in Germany as the confessor and spiritual director of a young widowed princess, Elizabeth of Hungary, later Saint Elizabeth, a woman famous for her charity to the poor. His direction of her was brutal even by the standards of the era. He separated her from her children, beat her, and by some accounts had her whipped for disobedience. She died at 24, worn through. Contemporaries were already uneasy about him. Then in 1231, Gregory made him the first papal inquisitor in German lands, and Conrad went to work with a theory. Hidden among the population were secret worshippers of Lucifer who kissed toads and cold demonic bodies at midnight gatherings. His method was speed. An accusation from anyone, however obtained, was enough. The accused could confess and betray their friends, or burn. Trials could begin and end in a day, and men and women went from denunciation to the stake before their families understood what was happening. He rode circuit through the Rhineland on a mule, trailed by assistants, among them, the chronicles say, a lay helper called Conrad Tors, and a one-eyed, one-handed man named John, both credited with the ability to identify a heretic on sight, and his own contemporaries, churchmen, not skeptics, described his tribunals as monstrous, with one chronicler recording that he burned the innocent and the guilty alike. Conrad made the mistake of moving up the social ladder and accusing a count of the Luciferian conspiracy. The count demanded a proper hearing before bishops, got one, and was cleared. Shortly afterward, on the 30th of July, 1233, Conrad was ambushed on the road near Marburg by a party of knights and hacked to death along with his companion. The Pope mourned him as a martyr. Germany, notably, did not clamour for a replacement, and serious inquisition in the region went quiet for a long time. France produced a similar figure with an even darker origin. Robert le Bougre, Robert the Bulgarian, the nickname a slur meaning roughly Robert the Heretic, because he was a convert who had allegedly spent years among the Cathars himself before joining the Dominicans, became an inquisitor in northern France around 1233 and inquisitor for the whole kingdom by 1235. Converts hunting their former co-believers tend to be effective, and Robert was devastating because he knew the signs, the phrases, the network. He also, by the accounts that survive, barely bothered with procedure. Chroniclers describe him identifying heretics by their gestures and manner of speaking, as though he could smell it. His masterpiece, if that's the word, came on the 29th of May, 1239, at a place called Montemay in Champagne, where a community of heretics had persisted for generations. Robert arrived, and within about 1 week for the entire process of investigation, trial, and sentencing of an entire community, he had condemned around 180 people. They were burned together on a single day in one enormous holocaust on the hill, in the presence of the Count of Champagne and a crowd of nobles and prelates gathered as if for a festival. A monastic chronicler recorded the number and the date and moved on. 180 people, a village's worth of men and women, screaming in one fire on one afternoon, and it earns 4 lines in the annals. Robert's career eventually collapsed under complaints about his methods. The church quietly shelved him, and one tradition says he ended his life imprisoned. The burnings stayed burned. Down south, meanwhile, the last act of the Cathar War was approaching, and it happened on a mountain. Montségur sits on top of a limestone crag in the foothills of the Pyrenees, a castle above cloud level, and by the 1240s it had become the unofficial capital of what remained of the Cathar Church, home to a garrison of soldiers and a community of perfecti, including bishops of the faith. After Cathar sympathizers connected to the fortress murdered a party of inquisitors in their beds at Avignonnet in 1242, the assassins reportedly smashed the inquisitors' skulls and took the tribunal's records. The French crown decided Montségur had to end. The siege lasted around 10 months through a mountain winter, supplies coming up the cliff paths by night, until Basque mercenaries scaled a face of the rock that the defenders had considered unclimbable and took an outwork. The garrison negotiated a surrender with a strange 15-day truce built into it, and the terms were the usual ones. Soldiers walk free, believers who renounce walk free, perfecti who refuse to renounce burn. During those 15 days, something happened that shows you the pull of this faith. A number of the ordinary defenders, soldiers and their wives, people who were free to leave, asked to receive the consolamentum. They chose, with the fire already visible in their future, to convert into the category that guaranteed their death. On the 16th of March, 1244, somewhere between 210 and 215 people were brought down the mountain path. A palisade had been built in the field at the base and packed with pyre wood. The accounts suggest they weren't tied to individual stakes. The numbers were too great, but enclosed together inside the fence of stakes and burned as a mass. The fortress's community, bishops and weavers and soldiers' wives together. The meadow at the foot of the mountain is still called the Prat dels Cremats, the field of the burned. Depositions taken from survivors later described a coda. On the night before the burning, a handful of perfecti were lowered by rope down the sheer face of the mountain, carrying away the church's remaining treasure and writings, and they vanished into the caves of the Sabartes. And treasure hunters have been digging up that country ever since. Catharism itself survived Montségur by a few generations, in hiding, in the mountains, in exile in Lombardy, but as a public faith with a home, it died in that field. 8 years later, the legal framework caught up with the practice. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued a bull called Ad Extirpanda, and among its provisions, it formally authorized the use of torture to extract confessions from accused heretics. Now, torture wasn't a papal invention. Roman law had used it, and the secular courts of Europe were rediscovering it enthusiastically in this same century. But this document brought it inside the Church's own process, with rules attached. The torture was to stop short of death or the loss of a limb. It was to be applied only once. It was supposed to be used only when the evidence was already strong. Those limits sound almost restrained until you watch what happened to each of them in practice. Only once became a fiction almost immediately, through a piece of legal wordplay you're going to see used on a woman in Toledo 3 centuries later. A torture session that ended without a confession was never described as finished. It had merely been suspended, and a suspended session could be continued another day, and a continuation, legally speaking, was still the first session. A man could be tortured on Monday, Thursday, and the following Tuesday, and the record would show one application of torture, ongoing. As for the rule against bloodshed and mutilation, the methods that became standard were selected precisely to honor it on a technicality. Ropes, water, and stretching tear people apart on the inside while leaving the outside more or less presentable. And in 1256, Pope Alexander IV added the final convenience. Inquisitors were empowered to absolve each other for any irregularities committed in the course of the work. If something went wrong in the chamber, if a session went too far, if a prisoner died, the inquisitor could be cleansed of it by his colleague across the table, and the work could continue. The machine now maintained itself, and it kept records like nothing else in medieval Europe. The man who shows you what the mature system looked like is Bernard Gouy, Inquisitor of Toulouse from 1307 to 1323, the man modern audiences vaguely know as the villain of The Name of the Rose, a portrayal his defenders consider unfair and his registers make complicated. Gouy wrote the profession's great handbook, a manual laying out how to interrogate each sect, what evasions to expect, how a Waldensian will dodge a question about oaths, how to trap a Cathar sympathizer through his relatives. His surviving book of sentences covers his years in office, over 630 judgments. Of those, about 42 or 43 people were handed over to be burned alive. Roughly 69 more sentences were pronounced against the dead. Corpses ordered dug up out of consecrated ground, dragged through the streets and burned, sometimes decades after burial, with the town crier announcing the name of the person whose bones were on the cart. Hundreds more went to prison, in some cases the harsh regime called the strict wall, chained in a cell on bread and water indefinitely. And the registers themselves were a weapon that outlasted any sentence. Gouy's records were indexed, cross-referenced, organized by family and by village, so that a man questioned in 1320 could be confronted with what his grandmother had confessed in 1270. One modern historian who studied these archives described the inquisitors as pioneers of data retrieval, and he wasn't being cute. Your family's file never closed. A slip by your grandfather sat in a folder in Toulouse waiting, and it would still be there when your grandson said something careless at a wedding. People in the Languedoc learned to live as though everything said in front of anyone might eventually be written down, because it might. That low, permanent hum of caution in every conversation is a punishment the registers don't record, and it fell on everyone, including the perfectly innocent, for generations. A document from this era became the profession's Bible, and it lets you hear the mind of the enterprise talking shop. In 1376, the Inquisitor General of Aragon, Nicholas Eymerich, compiled the Directorium Inquisitorum, the Directory of Inquisitors, a complete operating manual that stayed in use, updated and reprinted for 300 years. Eymerich is disarmingly frank. He complains that torture is an unreliable tool, noting that the weak will confess anything and the strong will withstand everything, and then he explains how to use it anyway. He devotes a chapter to the verbal tricks of heretics under questioning, and a matching chapter of tricks for the questioner. Pretend to have proof you don't have. Flip through papers as though the file already contains everything and sigh at the prisoner's stubbornness. Feign kindness. Have a colleague play the sympathetic visitor who drops by the cell to advise confession as a friend. Promise mercy. And Eymerich walks the inquisitor through exactly how to do this without technically lying. The inquisitor may promise mercy while privately intending the mercy owed to the church or to the state rather than to the prisoner. Mercy in that vocabulary could mean a quicker death. Plant an informer among the prisoners. Plant one who claims to be a heretic himself to draw confidences in the dark. Every one of those techniques appears in action in the transcripts we've been through today, 2 and 3 centuries after the manual prescribed them. The shuffled papers, the false friends, the cell spies, the ambiguous mercy. And when the Directorium was republished in Rome in 1578, in the great modern edition used across the Spanish and Roman systems alike, a canon lawyer named Francisco Peña supplied a commentary, and in it he wrote a sentence that historians of the institution quote more than any other because it drops the mask entirely. We must remember, Peña advised his colleagues, that the essential aim of the trial and death sentence is not saving the soul of the accused, but procuring the public good and terrorizing the people. His words: punishment as pedagogy, the stake as a teaching aid, and the intended student stood in the crowd, taking the lesson home, so that others, seeing the punishment, would be scared away from the evils they might otherwise commit. Those are his clauses, not mine. The entire apparatus, the processions and the painted sacks and the fires, described by its own leading legal commentator as an instrument for the production of fear in the innocent. Carry Peña's sentence with you through the rest of this video. Everything you're about to see in Spain is that sentence staged. The medieval version of this machine ground the Cathars out of existence over about a century, chased the Waldensians into the Alps, and then, with its original prey gone, went relatively quiet in most of Europe. The story could almost end there, as a grim medieval episode. Instead, in the late 1400s, the whole apparatus was picked up, redesigned, and plugged into the power of a modern centralizing state. And that combination, medieval procedure, Renaissance bureaucracy, royal backing, produced the institution whose name still gets used as shorthand for organized cruelty. For that, we cross the Pyrenees. Medieval Spain, for all its wars, had been home to the largest Jewish population in Europe, communities that had lived on the peninsula since Roman times, longer than most of the Christian kingdoms had existed. That world broke in the summer of 1391. Anti-Jewish riots that began in Seville, whipped up by a preaching archdeacon, spread city by city like a fever. Córdoba, Toledo, Valencia, Barcelona, and for months mobs sacked the Jewish quarters, killing thousands and offering the survivors a choice at knife point: baptism or death. Enormous numbers chose baptism. Over the following decades, through continued pressure, preaching campaigns and discriminatory laws, more followed, until by the middle of the 1400s, Spain contained hundreds of thousands of conversos, new Christians, families that had been Jewish within living memory, and were now, officially, as Catholic as the king. Some embraced the new faith completely and produced bishops and friars. Some converted in name and kept the old observances behind closed doors, lighting candles on Friday night with the shutters closed. Most probably lived somewhere in the blurry middle, sincere enough in church, sentimental about grandmother's customs at home, the way people actually are. And crucially, conversos, being legally Christian, could now do everything the law had barred Jews from doing. They entered the town councils, the cathedral chapters, the universities, the royal service, and they married into the nobility, and they prospered, and the old Christian population watched them prosper and reached for a new kind of hatred, because the old religious hatred no longer technically applied to baptized Catholics. The new version fixated on blood. In 1449, during a tax revolt in Toledo, the city government issued a decree called the Sentencia Estatuto, barring anyone of Jewish descent from holding any office in the city, regardless of the sincerity of their faith or how many generations back the conversion lay. The Pope condemned it within months, in a formal document affirming that all Christians are equal whatever their descent. The idea outlived his objection by about 400 years, and will come back to what it did to Spanish life, because those purity of blood statutes eventually crawled into everything. For the moment, hold Spain in the 1470s in your head. A huge, resented converso population, a popular belief that many of them were secret Jews mocking the sacraments, and two new monarchs, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, who had just fought a civil war for the throne and wanted their patched-together kingdoms unified, orderly, and unquestionably Catholic. In 1478, at their request, the Pope issued a bull allowing them to establish an inquisition in Castile, and one change made the Spanish version historically unique. This inquisition would be appointed by the crown, run under the crown, funded by the confiscated property of the people it condemned, with that property flowing towards the royal treasury. Rome had built the weapon. Spain took the weapon home and pointed it. Popes spent the next decades intermittently trying to restrain the thing they'd authorized and intermittently being ignored. The first tribunal went to work in Seville, and the fear arrived before the inquisitors finished unpacking. Thousands of conversos simply fled the city at the news. The tribunal responded by declaring that flight was itself evidence of guilt and demanding the nobles of the region hand back anyone who'd taken refuge on their lands. On the 6th of February 1481, Seville held the first auto de fe of the Spanish Inquisition, and 6 men and women were burned alive. Within days there were more. A local chronicler, a priest, wrote approvingly that the fires had begun and would burn for a long time, and he was better at prophecy than he knew. Seville built a permanent burning platform outside the walls, a stone stage called the Quemadero, with 4 large statues at its corners. Later legend claimed the hollow plaster figures were used to roast victims inside them, though the contemporary accounts describe them simply as ornaments for a structure the city expected to use indefinitely. Think about that as a piece of municipal planning. A permanent installation, budgeted and built, on the assumption that the burning of citizens was now a fixture of civic life, like a market or a fountain. Within a decade, the civilian tribunal alone had put hundreds of people into that fire. A story told in Seville afterward, It appears in later chronicles, so treat it as the city talking to itself about its own wound. Said the crackdown was triggered when a young conversa woman, in love with a Christian nobleman, told him about secret meetings in her father's house, and that her father, a wealthy merchant named Diego de Suzanne, went to the stake among the first victims. The records confirm a Susan condemned in those early months. The tale of the beautiful daughter, whose remorse supposedly drove her to a convent and then to ruin, grew in the telling for centuries, a wound the city kept polishing. Numbers from these early years are genuinely horrifying, the worst of the entire 3.5-century run. The most careful modern archival work suggests that up to around 1530, the Spanish tribunals executed somewhere around 2,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them conversos, accused of secretly practicing Judaism, and that this opening half-century accounts for more than 3/4 of everyone the Spanish Inquisition would ever kill. One scholar's estimate for the single tribunal of Toledo: about 250 people burned in person between 1485 and 1501, a mid-sized town's parish register worth of neighbours, marched out of one city's gates in 16 years. In Ciudad Real, a smaller city, the visiting tribunal held an auto on the 23rd of February, 1484, at which 30 people were burned alive in a single day, along with 40 effigies of the dead and the fled. Stop on the effigies for a second, because they're going to keep appearing, and they say a great deal about the mindset. If a suspect died in prison before sentencing, or died peacefully years before ever being accused or escaped abroad, the tribunal did not consider the case closed. A life-sized figure was made, dressed in the penitential garb, sometimes labelled with the name, sometimes, when the person had died in custody, accompanied by a box containing their actual exhumed bones, and the figure was solemnly sentenced and burned in the person's place. The heirs still lost the inheritance, since a posthumous conviction voided the estate backward. Escape, even escape by dying, was not recognized. Presiding over the system as it spread, tribunal by tribunal, Córdoba, Toledo, Valencia, Zaragoza, eventually a permanent network across Spain and its empire, was the man whose name became a synonym for the whole enterprise: Tomás de Torquemada, Dominican friar, confessor to Queen Isabella, appointed the first Inquisitor General. By an irony that his own tribunals would have found actionable in anyone else, several early sources report that Torquemada himself came from a family with converso blood a couple of generations back. He was austere, tireless, incorruptible in the financial sense, and absolutely convinced. In 1484, he issued the instructions that standardized procedure across all the tribunals: how an investigation opens, how evidence is weighed, and, in Article 15, when torture may be applied. Where the evidence amounts to half-proof, the accused may be put to the question. Half-proof: one witness instead of two, or strong suspicion without confession. Under Torquemada's 15 years, the machine ran at its hottest, and even contemporaries choked on it. Complaints flowed to Rome about the burnings and the confiscations, and toward the end of his life, the Pope gently attached colleagues to share his authority, about the closest thing to a rebuke the system ever produced from within. He also kept, reportedly, a personal guard of dozens of mounted men and a horn of unicorn on his table as a defense against poison, a man perfectly certain of God's favor, and perfectly certain half of Spain wanted him dead. Both beliefs were reasonable. In Zaragoza in 1485, conversos actually did assassinate an inquisitor, Pedro de Arbues, cutting him down at midnight while he knelt at prayer in the cathedral. He wore a mail shirt and a steel cap under his robes, so they went for his neck. If the conspirators hoped to intimidate the tribunal, they achieved the precise opposite. The manhunt that followed devastated the converso elite of Aragon. The assassins died horribly. Hands cut off, dragged, quartered, and Arbues became a martyr and eventually a saint. And the Inquisition in Aragon, previously resisted by local institutions, became untouchable. One murder bought the tribunal a century of momentum. Then came 1492 and the decision that reshaped the peninsula. In January, Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella. In March, riding the crest of that triumph, the monarchs signed the Alhambra Decree. Every unconverted Jew in Castile and Aragon had until the end of July to accept baptism or leave the kingdoms forever, on pain of death, taking no gold, no silver, no coined money. The stated logic connects directly to our subject. The decree itself argues that the presence of practicing Jews tempted the conversos back toward their old faith. So the Inquisition's work of purifying the new Christians required removing the old community entirely. Estimates of how many people went into exile that summer range widely, from 40,000 up toward 200,000, out of a community of maybe 300,000, with the balance converting under the deadline, and scholars still argue the split. What we have in close focus is what the departure looked like, because a parish priest named Andrés Bernaldez, no friend of the Jews at all, described it in his chronicle. Families sold what couldn't be carried for whatever was offered in the panic of a forced market, and he records the going rates: a house traded for a donkey, a vineyard for a small piece of cloth. He describes the roads to the ports that summer full of families walking, the young carrying the old, women carrying children, some giving birth beside the road, some dying beside it. And this detail is his, an eyewitness hostile to them, that the rabbis had the young people sing and play tambourines as they walked to keep the people's spirits up. At the ports, worse waited. Overloaded ships, captains who took payment and then robbed or drowned their passengers, plague in the holds, exiles dumped on North African beaches and stripped by bandits. Stories circulated, and Bernaldez repeats them, of passengers murdered at sea by crews who'd heard the refugees had swallowed their gold coins to smuggle them out, and who opened them up to check. Communities that had been in Spain for 1,000 years, families who could walk you to Roman-era graves of their ancestors, ended in a single summer. The exiles carried Spanish with them, and their descendants in Istanbul and Salonika and Morocco were still speaking a 15th century Spanish, Ladino, into living memory, a language preserved like a fly in amber at the moment of the expulsion. And now watch the trap close. Every Jew who converted under that deadline, rather than leave, immediately came under the Inquisition's jurisdiction. The tribunal couldn't touch a professing Jew who was outside the church. A baptized one was inside and watchable forever. The decree that emptied Spain of Judaism simultaneously restocked the Inquisition's hunting grounds with tens of thousands of brand new, resentful, half-instructed converts. Every one of them now legally capable of committing heresy by doing what they'd done openly the year before. The tribunals would live off that population for 2 centuries. How did it actually work then, from the point of view of a person caught in it? Step by step then, the procedure is where the cruelty lived. The fires get the attention, and we'll get to the fires in full, but the fires were rare compared to this. The process happened to tens of thousands of people, and it was engineered, whether by design or by evolution, to inflict the maximum possible dread at every stage while keeping the paperwork immaculate. It usually began with a sermon. When a tribunal arrived in a district or opened a new campaign, the inquisitors published what was called an edict of grace, later an edict of faith. The town assembled in church, attendance effectively compulsory, and listened to a catalogue of heresies described in detail. And notice the double edge of that, since for many listeners this was the most complete education in secret Judaism they'd ever received, courtesy of the institution hunting it. Anyone guilty of the listed practices had a window, typically 30 or 40 days, to come forward voluntarily and confess. Confess within the window, and you'd be reconciled gently, spared the stake and the confiscation. One catch. A confession only counted as full and sincere if you also named everyone else. Your mother who lit the candles, your brother-in-law who wouldn't touch pork, the neighbor you once saw wash her hands before prayer. A confession that spared your circle was, by definition, an incomplete confession, and an incomplete confession was worse than none, since it proved you were shielding heretics. Then, when the period of grace expired, the same edict required every good Christian, under pain of excommunication and prosecution, to denounce anyone they suspected, not knew, suspected. The signs to watch for were helpfully listed. Clean clothes on Saturday, no smoke from the chimney on Saturday, avoiding pork, washing a corpse in warm water, turning the face to the wall to die. A community that had listened to that sermon walked out of the church transformed. Every servant was now a potential informer with a legal duty. Every grudge had a mailbox. Business rivals, jilted suitors, feuding in-laws, the woman next door who envied your kitchen. All of them could now put your name in the tribunal's ear, in secret, with no obligation to face you, ever. Denunciations went into the record, and when the file thickened enough, the tribunal issued an arrest order, and the arrest itself was built for terror. The familiars, lay agents of the Holy Office, a badge that noblemen competed for, since it carried privileges and a certain menacing glamour, came for people at night. A knock, a warrant, and a person left their home and dropped out of the world. Into the cárceles secretas, the secret prisons, and secret is the operative word, incommunicado, completely. No visits, no letters, no messages in or out. Families were told nothing. Not the charge, not the location, sometimes not even a confirmation of custody. A husband taken in the night simply stopped existing, and his wife could spend the following years in a limbo, where mourning wasn't allowed and hope wasn't rational. At the moment of arrest, the prisoner's property was inventoried down to the spoons and sequestered, held by the tribunal, and one detail lays the accounting culture bare: the cost of the prisoner's food, and the salaries of the jailers, and the expenses of the trial were paid out of the sequestered estate. You financed your own imprisonment. A long trial could eat a family's entire wealth before any verdict existed, so that even an acquitted man could come home after 4 years to find his children begging and his business gone, consumed legally by the process of determining that he had done nothing. If the verdict went the other way, confiscation was total and retroactive, and this produced one of the nastiest wrinkles in the whole system. Since heresy was calculated from the moment of the first offence, not the conviction, every sale, dowry and gift the condemned had made in the intervening decades could be voided and clawed back. Buy a vineyard in good faith from a man who, 15 years later, was posthumously convicted of having Judaized 20 years earlier, and the tribunal could take the vineyard from you because he'd never legally owned it after his crime. Whole networks of commerce around convicted families simply detonated. Doing business with a converso became in itself a financial risk, and everyone understood the implication, and the isolation tightened accordingly. Inside the prison, time was a weapon. Months routinely passed before a prisoner learned why he was there, and years-long detentions before trial were common enough that the archives are full of them. The prisoner sat in a cell, and accuracy demands a strange admission. The physical conditions varied and were sometimes, by the standards of the age, not the worst part. One modern historian went through the records and concluded the Inquisition's cells were often better kept than the royal prisons, and prisoners of the secular courts occasionally blasphemed on purpose to get transferred into inquisitorial custody, where at least the food arrived. Take that on board and then set it beside what the custody was actually doing to people, because what did the damage in those cells was the silence. When the hearings finally began, they opened with a move of pure psychological genius. The prisoner was brought before the inquisitors, sworn on the cross, and invited to confess. Confess what? He'd ask. That they would not say. Search your conscience, they'd tell him, and confess the sins that brought you here, because surely a man knows his own offenses. The tribunal never told you the charge, you had to guess it. Sit with what that does to a mind. An innocent man, or a man innocent of anything he could think of, now had to review his entire life for the crime, knowing that guessing wrong was catastrophic in both directions. Confess to something they didn't have, and you'd handed them a new crime and proven yourself a liar in the process. Deny everything while they held solid testimony, and you were an impenitent heretic sitting on his guilt, and impenitence was the specific quality that lit the fires. Prisoners broke themselves against this. The archives preserve people confessing in expanding circles across multiple hearings, offering up every sin and half-sin and rumor about themselves they could dredge up, trying to strike the invisible target, while the inquisitors sat, took notes, and repeated that the confession did not yet appear to be full. Eventually, a formal accusation was published, drawn from testimony whose sources were concealed. The witnesses were never named. Their statements were edited before the accused saw them, stripped of any date, place, or circumstance that might identify who had spoken, on the stated ground that identified witnesses would face retaliation. Whatever the merit of that fear, follow the consequence. You could not confront your accuser, and you could barely rebut an accusation deliberately blurred to protect them. The defense you were allowed was real but strangled. An advocate was assigned, chosen from the tribunal's own approved list, and his formal duty, if he became convinced of your guilt, ran to the court, not to you. Several manuals instruct the advocate to urge a guilty client to confess and abandon the defense. Your two practical tools were tachus and abonos. You could submit a list of everyone you could think of who hated you, with reasons, hoping to blindly name a hidden witness and have their testimony discounted as malice, and you could call character witnesses to your good Christian conduct. Prisoners, therefore, sat in their cells compiling inventories of their own enemies. Every quarrel of a lifetime, every debt and slight and border dispute, guessing at who had done this to them. Some guessed right and saved themselves. Some sat there realizing the testimony could only have come from inside their own house. Children denounced parents. Wives denounced husbands. Go through enough case files and it stops being shocking, because the system was purpose-built to crack households open. A person arrested and facing torture bought mercy with names, and the names nearest to hand. The people you'd actually seen light candles or skip pork were your own blood. Reconciliation required completeness. Shielding your mother voided your confession. So the records fill up with exactly what you'd expect and can hardly bear to look at. A teenager's testimony convicting her father, sisters cross-denouncing each other in adjoining cells, a man confirming details about his wife, because his own children had already supplied them, and denial would kill him without saving her. One case from the Mexican tribunal preserves a family's destruction in sequence. We'll spend real time in Mexico later, with a family whose file runs to thousands of pages, where the interrogators worked through the members like a man taking apart a watch, each confession preloading the next arrest. The tribunal called this the discovery of complices, accomplices. The word for your family in the files is accomplices. And through all of it, at every hearing, in the corner of every room, sat the notary. Every tribunal ran on them. Everything was transcribed. Questions, answers, evasions, silences noted as silences. And, in the chamber we're about to enter, screams noted as screams. The Holy Office was, among all the things it was, the most disciplined record-keeping operation in early modern Europe. And its archives, millions of pages, are the reason we can do what we're about to do, 4.5 centuries later, and stand in a specific basement in Toledo, on specific dates in 1568, next to a specific woman. Her name was Elvira del Campo, wife of Alonso de Moya, a scribe of Toledo. The charges against her, assembled from the testimony of people who had eaten at her table and worked in her house. She did not eat pork, and she put on clean linen on Saturdays. That's the whole indictment. Those two habits, sworn to by witnesses she never got to see, were the legally sufficient signature of a secret Jew. When the accusation was finally shown to her, she admitted the habits readily. She just denied the meaning. She didn't eat pork, she said, because it made her ill. She'd been that way since childhood. It disagreed with her. And as for the linen, she changed it because it was clean and pleasant, not for any law of Moses. And with that answer, she walked into the deepest trap in inquisitorial law, the question of intention. The acts were established and admitted. What remained uncertain was the inside of her head. The tribunal's response was to vote her to the torture, in the formal phrase, on intention. To apply physical pain to a woman in order to establish the motive behind her laundry. The chamber, on the day, looked like this. Every piece of it specified in the manuals and reflected in the transcript. The inquisitors present, a representative of the bishop, the executioner, a physician on call, and the notary at his desk with his paper and ink. Before anything began, the formal protestation was pronounced, one of the most repulsive sentences early modern law ever perfected. The prisoner was warned that if, during the torture, she should die, or suffer broken bones, or effusion of blood, or mutilation, the fault and the sin would be hers alone for refusing to tell the truth and not the tribunal's. They made the victim legally responsible in advance for whatever they were about to do to her body. Then she was ordered stripped. For a respectable woman of 16th century Spain, standing naked in a cellar in front of a room of clergymen and officials, this was already a violation profound enough that the transcripts show prisoners pleading during the disrobing before anyone touched them. Elvira did. The record has her crying out as the garments came off, "Señores, I have done all that is said of me, and I bear false witness against myself, for I do not want to see myself in such trouble. Please God, I have done nothing. Note what she's doing there, because it's the position the procedure forced on people, offering a confession and retracting it in the same breath, begging them to accept a guilty plea she is simultaneously telling them is untrue. The session began with the chords. The potro was the workhorse of the Spanish tribunals, a trestle frame on which the prisoner was bound with ropes wound around the limbs, each rope tightened by twisting a stick, a garrote, turn by turn, so that the cords bit through skin and into muscle. The transcript counts the turns. One cord on the arms, twisted, and the admonition repeated, "Tell the truth." She said she had nothing to tell. Another turn. She screamed. The notary wrote down that she screamed. Then the words start tumbling, and I'll give them to you as the notary recorded them. A summary would be a mercy the original doesn't offer. Tell me what you want, for I don't know what to say. Loosen me, señores, and tell me what I have to say. I do not know what I have done. O Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. More turns. I did not eat pork, for it made me sick. I have done everything. Loosen me, and I will tell the truth. They loosened nothing. She was asked to state what she had done, and she said, "What am I wanted to tell? I did it, and I have confessed. Señor, remind me of what I have to say, for I don't know it." Take that plea in again. A woman asking her torturers to tell her the crime so she can confess to it, and the tribunal declining because a prompted confession was procedurally worthless. The whole point was that she had to produce, from her own mouth, unprompted, a confession matching evidence she'd never seen. The cords kept their count. She said her arms were breaking. She asked why they would not tell her what to say. She said over and over in slightly different words that she had done it, whatever it was, that she was a sinner, that they should say the thing and she would swear to it. Then they moved her to the water. The apparatus for the toca was a sloped trestle, sometimes called the escalera, the ladder, with sharpened rungs pressing into the back. The prisoner bound onto it head downward, the head held immobile. Some accounts describe an iron band across the forehead, and an iron prong called the bostezo, forcing the jaws apart. A strip of linen, the toca itself, was pushed into the mouth and down into the throat, and then water was poured from a jar, holding a little over a quart, soaking down the cloth, so that the prisoner swallowed and inhaled and drowned by degrees on dry land, the linen dragging the water into the windpipe. The tribunals measured the severity of a session in jars, and the number of jars went into the record like a dosage. When the cloth was hauled back up the throat, it came out wet and sometimes bloody, and the choking prisoner was invited between jars to tell the truth. Elvira's session, by the tribunal's own standards, was recorded as mild. She was given only a single jar. Somewhere in the middle of all this, the transcript records her being asked once more to state plainly what she had done, and her answer has stayed with everyone who has ever worked through this file. "Señores," she asked, "why will you not tell me what I have to say?" And shortly after, "I said that I did not want to eat it," meaning the pork, and the questioners pressed, and her answers dissolved into repetitions and fragments, and the session was, in the record's own word, suspended. You'll remember that word from 1252. 4 days later, they brought her back down. The manuals and the medical men of the tribunals understood something about the human body that the 4-day gap exploited deliberately. Torn muscle and bruised tissue stiffen. A limb that has been corded and released is far more sensitive on the 4th day than the 1st. The 2nd session was legally the same session as the 1st, a continuation. So the rule permitting only one application of torture remained pristine in the file. The transcript of the 2nd session is shorter. Confronted with the trestle and the cords again, on a body 4 days into its bruising, Elvira del Campo broke. She confessed to Judaism, to having observed the law of Moses in her heart, the intention they'd been mining for, and she begged for mercy, and the notary, whose prose betrays no feeling anywhere across all these pages, recorded the confession as obtained. A 19th century historian who spent his career in these archives, Henry Charles Lee, a sober man not given to editorializing, described the recording of her case as passionless and businesslike, and singled out this transcript out of the thousands he'd handled as almost unbearable. Within 24 hours, by rule, the confession had to be ratified. The prisoner, back in a normal room, away from the instruments, was asked to confirm freely what she'd said under torture. Prisoners who revoked at ratification faced the obvious problem, since a revoked confession put the file back where it started, and the session, legally, had merely been suspended. Almost everyone ratified. Elvira ratified. She appeared at an auto da fe, was formally reconciled to the church, had her property confiscated, and was sentenced to the San Benito and a term of imprisonment, later moderated. The sack, with her name on it, went up on a church wall in Toledo. Her children inherited nothing except the name on the sack, a strange, cold detail from the account books before we move on. The third standard technique, alongside the cords and the water, was the garrucha, the pulley, wrists bound behind the back, the prisoner hoisted to the ceiling by them, so the arms rotate hideously in their sockets, weights sometimes hung from the feet, and then the drop, checked short with a jerk that wrenched the shoulders and could pull them from their sockets outright. By the middle of the 1600s, at least one tribunal, Córdoba, had quietly retired the garrucha from use, along with a few older practices like the brazier of coals applied to the soles of the feet, and its stated reason survives. The pulley kept dislocating people. Permanent injury violated the rules. The tribunal accordingly streamlined its inventory down to the cords and the rack, the tools that hurt just as much and broke less, as a workshop retires an implement that damages the material. The register these documents are written in all the way through is maintenance. And in case Elvira's outcome tempts anyone toward relief that at least she lived, set her file next to another woman's from the same archive, Marina Gonzalez of Ciudad Real, a generation earlier. Marina had confessed voluntarily under an edict of grace back in the 1480s, been reconciled, and gone back to her life. And reconciliation was a one-time offer. Years later, she was denounced afresh. The testimony describing the same familiar signatures, the clean linen, the avoided pork, now aggravated into relapse, and a relapsed heretic, was beyond mercy by definition. She was tortured with the water jars. The transcript survives, with its counts. She was condemned, and she went to the fire. First offense, second offense. The same laundry, the same butcher's stall. The difference between a sack on a wall and a stake was, in the end, chronology. The sentence itself was delivered at the ceremony everyone has heard of, the auto da fe, the act of faith, and the phrase describes exactly what the event claimed to be, a public liturgy in which justice was performed as worship. The popular image gets one thing wrong in an understandable direction. Nobody was burned at an auto da fe, strictly speaking. The auto was the religious ceremony, the procession, the mass, the sermon, the solemn public announcement of every sentence. The church did not execute anyone. Its formula for the condemned was that they were relaxed to the secular arm, handed over, released, relaxed, one of history's great obscene euphemisms, with an official plea that the civil authorities treat them with mercy and without the shedding of blood. Everyone in the transaction knew that without shedding of blood meant fire, and that the plea for mercy was a ritual fiction, and that a magistrate who actually showed mercy to a relaxed heretic would shortly be explaining himself to the tribunal. The state did the killing at a separate site, usually outside the walls, at the quemadero, the burning place. The church kept its hands formally clean at a distance of about half a mile. To see a great auto at full scale stand in the Plaza Mayor of Madrid on the 30th of June, 1680. We can reconstruct this one almost hour by hour because an official eyewitness account was published, written by José del Olmo, who helped stage the event, and a court painter, Francisco Rizzi, produced an enormous canvas of the scene that hangs in the Prado today, tiers of spectators rendered face by face. The occasion was partly celebratory. The young king, Charles II, had recently married a French princess, and the capital's tribunal assembled a spectacular auto in honor of the marriage, a wedding gift consisting of 118 prisoners. Preparations ran for a month. Carpenters built a stadium in the plaza, an amphitheater of staged seating, royal boxes, altars, and a great cage-like structure for the accused. And the account tells us the men who supplied the wood marched in the opening procession with pride of place. The night before, the Green Cross procession wound through Madrid by torchlight, Dominicans singing, carrying the Green Cross of Hope to the Plaza altar, and the 50 soldiers of the faith, the tribunal's guard, escorting it. Charcoal braziers and the stacked wood were already waiting at the brasero outside the Fuencarral gate. The day itself began before dawn and ran, by Del Olmo's account, something like 14 hours. The prisoners were marched out in careful order of ascending gravity, each with familiars at their elbows, through streets packed with what contemporaries estimated at 50,000 spectators, people having rented balconies along the route at scalpers' prices. First came the effigies on green poles, the mannequins of the dead and the escaped, some accompanied by small trunks painted with flames containing exhumed bones. Then the penitents in ascending order of ruin, the ones to be reconciled, in plain yellow San Benitos with the red cross of St. Andrew. Then those spared burning but sentenced to scourging or the galleys. And at the rear, the relajados, the ones going to the fire, in black San Benitos painted with flames and devils, wearing the carroza, the tall pasteboard cone painted to match, each carrying a green cross and accompanied by 2 friars working on them, right up to the last hour, for the conversion that would earn them the garrote. On the scaffold, the sentences were then chanted out one by one, each prisoner brought forward to a small pulpit to hear their life dismantled in legal Latin and Castilian, and with 118 cases, this took the entire day. The king sat through all of it. Etiquette required his presence at each sentencing, and there's a detail from these royal autos that historians keep returning to. At one point, the Inquisitor General ascended to the royal box, and Charles, the sovereign of half the world, swore a formal oath on the cross to defend the Holy Office and denounce its enemies. The tribunal put the oath in the king's mouth, and the direction of that promise is the whole political story of the institution in a single gesture. Of the 118, 104 were accused as Judaizers, most of them of Portuguese origin. The tribunals in that era were feeding heavily on Portuguese converso merchant families who'd migrated into Spain, and the sentences from that single day break down like this: dozens reconciled with prison, galleys, or the lash. 22 burned in effigy, 8 burned as corpses or bones, and 18 or 19 living human beings condemned to the fire. When the ceremony finally ended at nightfall, the relajados were loaded onto donkeys and taken out the gate to the brasero, a raised platform 60 feet square built for the occasion, where the stakes stood ready. And here the crowd watched the final sorting, the one that had been in negotiation all day. A condemned prisoner who confessed and kissed the cross, even at the stake itself, received the mercy of the garrote. An executioner strangled them with a cord or an iron collar from behind the stake, and the fire consumed a corpse. A prisoner who refused, who stayed in their faith to the end, burned alive. Del Olmo and the other accounts from Madrid that night record both outcomes. Most accepted the crucifix at the end, with the friars pressing it against their lips as the executioner took position behind them. A few refused, and among the refusals the accounts single out a man who, as the flames climbed, was seen to be still moving in the fire for a long time, and spectators near the platform, expecting an edifying spectacle, found something else. Burning a living human being is a slow business. The body does not surrender in the theatrical minute the paintings imply. Hair goes first in a flash, then the fire has to work, and the person is conscious for far more of it than anyone watching wants, and the sounds carry, and the smell. Witnesses across centuries and continents describe it identically. A thick, roasted sweetness that people who encountered it once flinched from for the rest of their lives when a kitchen fire caught fat. 50,000 people took that home from the wedding celebration. Some fraction of them, no doubt, had a wonderful day. The accounts also mention food vendors, and spare a minute for the rest of that day's list. The 18 or 19 at the stake can crowd out the other 100, and the other 100 are the normal case. Most sentences pronounced at an auto stopped short of death and were built to grind instead. Scourging was standard. Sentences of 100 or 200 lashes delivered in public, the penitent stripped to the waist and paraded through the streets on a donkey, while the executioner worked and a crier announced the crime. And the files show 200 lashes handed to women in their 60s and 70s. Sentences a strong young man might barely absorb, applied to grandmothers through the streets, with the neighbours watching from the same balconies. The galleys were slower, a term at the oar, 3 years, 5, 10, chained to a rowing bench in the Mediterranean fleet, was understood by everyone who pronounced it to be a death sentence on an installment plan for any but the toughest, and the tribunals supplied the Royal Navy with a steady stream of heretical muscle. The account books, ever practical, note the Crown's interest in able-bodied convictions. So-called perpetual prison, usually softened after a few years into a marked liberty, since the tribunals saw little point feeding a harmless penitent forever. And that marked liberty was its own quiet sentence. A reconciled penitent walked out into civil death. Barred from public office, from the professions, from bearing arms, from riding a horse, from wearing silk, gold, or jewels, and the same bans fell on their children and, for men, their grandchildren, none of whom had been convicted of anything. 2 generations dressed in plain wool, on foot, watching the neighbours ride past, every restriction a small daily announcement of the family's standing. Then the San Benito went up on the parish wall, and the announcement became permanent. The dead weren't done paying, though, and this loops us back to the church wall we started on. After the auto, each penitent's San Benito, painted with their name, their crime, and their punishment, was hung in their home parish, by regulation, permanently. The instruction of 1561 that I quoted at the start, perpetual memory of the infamy of the heretics and their descendants, was enforced with genuine diligence, sextons and notaries assigned to renew the fading garments, inventories taken to make sure none had quietly disappeared, because families did try to make them disappear. and getting caught removing your grandfather's San Benito was itself an offense against the Holy Office. A theologian of the tribunal defended the practice in print by reaching back to the Book of Numbers, to the rebels swallowed by the earth, whose censers were hammered into a covering for the altar as a sign for the children of Israel. A warning worked in metal, kept in front of the congregation forever. Substitute painted sackcloth and you have the system exactly. And its bite was practical, since the hanging sack fed directly into the purity of blood machinery we met back in 1449. Across the 1500s, those statutes metastasized through Spanish institutions, cathedral chapters, the military orders, the elite colleges, town councils, eventually even some guilds, each requiring proof that a candidate carried no Jewish or Muslim ancestry and no inquisitorial stain anywhere in the family tree. Applicants commissioned genealogical investigations of themselves, probanzas, with sworn witnesses and archival searches. And one document a probanza absolutely could not survive was an ancestor's name on a parish wall. Those sacks hung there, in effect, as a public genealogical database of the damned, consulted, literally, by investigators. Men were refused entry to religious orders over a great-great-grandmother. Families paid forgers to launder their trees, and other families made a business of maintaining the memory of exactly who descended from whom. And one of the ugliest words in the Spanish archives is the casual term for all this knowledge. Everyone simply knew who was clean. On Mallorca, where the sacks stayed up longest and the community was smallest, 15 surnames from the condemned of the 1600s became a permanent hereditary caste, the Suetas. Endogamous because nobody else would marry them, restricted to a single street of silversmiths' shops, and still facing marriage refusals and social exclusion within the lifetime of people alive now. Formal blood purity requirements for Spanish military and government posts were abolished by decree in the 1860s and 1870. Measure that span. A legal structure born in a 1449 tax riot outlasted the Inquisition itself, outlasted Napoleon, and had to be dismantled while railways were being built. The autos, meanwhile, were exported wholesale to the empire, and the American tribunals, Lima, Cartagena, Mexico City, ran the full apparatus at the far end of the world, San Benitos on cathedral walls in the Andes, a Quemadero in New Spain. And it's in Mexico that the archives hold the single most complete family tragedy the institution ever documented, a story that runs across 60 years and 2 generations, with a written voice at the center of it, because one of the victims left us his autobiography. He wrote it in secret, in a hand so small it strains modern eyes, in a book about the size of a deck of cards, and the only reason it survives is that his persecutors filed it as evidence. The Carvajals came to Mexico as a success story. Luis de Carvajal y de la Cueva, called the Elder, was a Portuguese-born conquistador and slaver-turned-governor who in 1579 won a royal contract to conquer and settle a vast territory in northern Mexico, the new Kingdom of Leon, and he was granted the unusual privilege of recruiting settlers without the standard proof of clean blood. So he filled his ships with his own extended family. His sister Francisca, her husband, their 9 children, cousins, in-laws, upward of 100 people, and a great many of them were secret Jews, of the deepest kind, families who had held on through a century of Iberian pressure. The governor himself, by every account, was a sincere Catholic. He apparently knew what his relatives were and looked away, and that looking away is what destroyed him. In 1589, the Mexican tribunal arrested the family, and the governor was convicted not of Judaizing, but of concealing it, of failing to denounce his own sister's household. Stripped of his governorship, sentenced to exile, he died in a cell before he could serve it. The tribunal would spend the next 60 years working through the people he'd brought over, generation by generation, and the archive it built on them runs to thousands of pages, because one of those people turned out to be a writer. Francisca's son Luis, the governor's nephew and namesake, was in his early 20s at the first arrest, and he is one of the most vivid human beings the colonial archives contain, since we have him from both directions. The tribunal's transcripts of him, and his own secret memoir, the little book I mentioned, written in a microscopic hand in notebooks that fit in a palm, the earliest known Jewish writing composed in the Americas. In it, he calls himself Joseph Lombroso, Joseph the Enlightened, and describes his awakening to the faith of his ancestors as a teenager, his self-circumcision in a ravine with a pair of worn scissors. He was, at the time, a boy alone in a canyon in northern Mexico, performing surgery on himself with shears in obedience to a verse in Genesis, and he records it as the proudest day of his life. The first trial, in 1589 and 90, gathered in Luis, his mother, and several of his sisters. His mother, Francisca, was tortured. He wasn't that first time, but he was made to watch what the process did to her, and at the auto of 1590, the family appeared in San Benito's and were reconciled, the one-time mercy, remember, with prison terms and perpetual penitential dress. Luis served his sentence partly as a scribe and teacher at a college, where the friars grew fond of him and gave him the run of a library full of scripture, and the irony of that arrangement apparently escaped everyone. The Holy Office had sentenced a hungry young crypto-Jew to several years inside a building full of Hebrew learning. His faith came out the far side of reconciliation hotter than it went in. The family resumed their observances, more carefully now, fasting in pairs, praying behind locked doors, and Luis kept his tiny chronicle of all of it, in ink, under a roof the tribunal had already visited once. When I said the archives preserve people, I meant it almost literally in his case. His voice off the page is warm, fervent, sometimes boyish, full of pet names for his sisters and raptures about God's mercies, and every page of it was, under the law he lived beneath, a death warrant in his own handwriting. They came back for the family in 1595. A denunciation, from within the wider community, from a man the family trusted, brought the whole network down, and this second file shows the machine at its most methodical. Luis in one cell, his mother and sisters in others, none of them knowing what the others had said, the inquisitors shuttling fragments of testimony between them. Luis at first admitted nothing, then admitted himself but shielded everyone else, and the tribunal, patient as ever, kept the sessions coming. From his cell, he tried to hold the family together by smuggled signal, messages to his sisters hidden in fruit, a pear with a note where the core should be, verses sung loudly enough to carry through walls, coded reassurances passed by a sympathetic fellow prisoner who was, naturally, reporting everything. In February of 1596, they took him to the chamber. The chords went on, and the transcript does to the modern reader exactly what Elvira's does. He screamed the same universal sentences, that he would say whatever they wanted, that they should tell him what to say. And then, turn by turn, he broke in the specific way the procedure was engineered to produce. Completeness, remember, was the requirement. Over the sessions that followed, Luis de Carvajal, Joseph the Enlightened, the proud heart of his family's faith, gave the tribunal more than 120 names. His mother, every sister, cousins, friends, associates across New Spain, the whole map of the community he'd spent his adult life protecting. The confession spared none of them and saved none of them, least of all him. As a relapsed heretic, reconciled once already, he was legally beyond mercy, and so were his mother and 3 of his sisters. The despair in his final months bled through the walls. Other prisoners later testified they heard him at night, and at one point he attempted to destroy himself by leaping from a window during the proceedings, and survived, broken, to be nursed back to health for execution, the tribunal's physicians patching a man so that he could be killed on schedule and in public. The auto came on the 8th of December, 1596, in the great plaza of Mexico City, one of the largest the New World had yet seen. Luis walked in the procession with his mother Francisca and his sisters Isabel, Catalina and Leonor, all in the painted Sanbenitos, all condemned to relaxation. Friars worked on Luis the whole route, and at the very end, the accounts differ on his interior state, and I'll leave you to weigh a conversion produced at the foot of a stake. He accepted the crucifix, and so did his mother and sisters, and they were granted the garrote, strangled at the stake, one after another, a family in a row, and then the fires were lit under the bodies. He was about 30. A 4th sister, Mariana, wasn't burned that day for a reason the record states plainly. Her mind had given way during the family's destruction, and even this tribunal balked briefly at burning the insane. They waited. In 1601, judged recovered enough to be responsible, Mariana de Carvajal was burned. The youngest child, a little girl called Anika during the first trials, was reconciled as a minor and released into a marked life, and keep her in mind for a few minutes. The archive is not finished with Anika. The community the Carvajal confessions had mapped was left to regrow in the tribunal's full view, and for a few decades Mexico's crypto-Jews lived in a strange hum of tolerated suspicion, everyone on file, nobody arrested, the tribunal watching. Then in the 1640s, the politics shifted. Portugal revolted against the Spanish crown, and every Portuguese converso in the empire became a suspected traitor twice over, and the Mexican tribunal launched the sweep known as the Great Conspiracy Trials. Hundreds of arrests. The prisons overflowed into rented houses, and it all drained toward the 11th of April 1649, and the ceremony remembered as the Gran Auto de Fe, the largest ever staged in the Americas. 109 cases, tens of thousands of spectators, stands built as at Madrid, the vice-regal court in attendance, and at the end of it 13 human beings relaxed in person, alongside dozens of effigies and chests of exhumed bones. The tribunal had gone into the graveyards for this one, digging up convicted ancestors so their remains could join the procession. 12 of the 13 accepted the cross and were garroted. The 13th is the reason this auto is remembered as something more than a body count, and his name was Tomás Trevino de Sobremonte. Trevino was a merchant in his late 50s, born in Old Castile, prosperous in Mexico, and a two-time guest of the tribunal, reconciled once back in the 1620s, which under the rules made this second conviction automatically fatal. What sets him apart in the record is that he stopped pretending. Somewhere in the years of his final imprisonment, Trevino quit the double life entirely and told the inquisitors to their faces what he was. The priest assigned to him in his last hours testified afterward that Trevino declared he was a Jew and was resolved to live and die in the law of Moses, and the trial record shows a man spending his final months debating scripture with his judges, unbending, almost serene. On the day, he refused the crucifix at the procession, refused it at the stake, and by the accounts of the friars, his enemies, writing to condemn him, he went into the fire alive and unrepentant, the only one of the 13. Mexican tradition gives him a last line, flung at the executioners as the wood caught, "Throw on more wood, wretches. It's my money that pays for it." A jab at the tribunal burning him with funds confiscated from his own estate. Trace that quote back, and the trail runs not to the trial record, but to a narrative poem written by a Mexican poet 2 centuries later. So what you make of it depends on how much credit you give a legend that grew around a documented core. The core needs no legend. The file itself shows a man who was offered, until the final instant, an easier death in exchange for one kiss on an object, and declined. And in the procession that same morning, among the condemned, walked a woman of about 67 named Ana de León Carvajal. Anica. The little girl reconciled in the 1590s, the last of Francisca's children, arrested in the Great Sweep, condemned as a relapsed heretic like her mother, her brother, and her 4 sisters before her. 53 years after she watched her family burn as a child, the tribunal completed its work on the house of Carvajal. She accepted the cross and was garroted before burning at the same quemadero, by the same institution, working from the same file that had been opened before she could talk. No family in the records of the Holy Office anywhere on earth was consumed so completely across so many years, and the tribunal's own paperwork is the tombstone. That and the little memoir, which the inquisitors preserved as exhibit and evidence, and thereby carried Joseph the Enlightened's voice safely through 4 centuries to us. It sat in the Mexican National Archives until the 1930s, when it was stolen, vanished for 80 years, surfaced at a New York auction house in 2016, priced as a curiosity, was identified, and went home to Mexico. You can see digitized pages of it now, the handwriting so small it looks at first like decorative lines, until it resolves, and a young man in a locked room in the 1590s starts talking to you about his sisters. Lima ran the South American branch of the same enterprise, and its archive holds the one prisoner who arguably outstubborned the entire system. Francisco Maldonado da Silva was a surgeon in Chile, born around 1592 in what's now Argentina, son of a converso physician who had himself been penanced by the tribunal. At 18, by his own account, Francisco asked his father about a book he'd found, and the father, after swearing him to secrecy, taught him the faith of his ancestors, and the young man took to it with a completeness that would eventually astonish his judges. He too circumcised himself, alone, with scissors. The denunciation, when it came in 1626, came from inside the walls of his own house. He confided in his devoutly Catholic sister, hoping to persuade her, and she went to the Holy Office. And he seems to have understood the risk and accepted it, because when the familiars came for him, he told them plainly what he was. Then he spent almost 13 years in the secret cells of Lima, making the tribunal's life miserable. He refused to swear his oaths on the cross, offering instead the God of Israel. He debated relays of theologians, the file records more than a dozen formal disputations, and held his ground in all of them, citing scripture from memory. He fasted so severely his jailers thought he'd die, and survived. He converted 2 fellow prisoners through the wall, and in the dark of his cell over years, he manufactured books. He saved scraps of paper, sewed them into gatherings with thread teased out of his rags, cut a pen from a chicken bone off his own plate, brewed ink from kitchen charcoal, and filled hundreds of tiny leaves with defenses of his faith, signing them as Healy the Nazarene, unworthy servant of the God of Israel. The tribunal confiscated them, filed them, and kept building its case. He went to the stake at Lima's Great Auto of January 1639, the climax of the so-called Great Complicity, a sweep against the city's Portuguese merchants that put about a dozen people into the fire in one day, including the richest man in Lima, Maldonado da Silva, burned alive, unrecanted, and the tribunal hung his handmade books around his neck so they would burn with him, the institution that archived everything, making one pointed exception, a chronicler of the auto records that, as the sentences ended, a wind tore the awning above the scaffold, and the surgeon looked up and said the God of Israel had done it, to look upon him face to face. Take the line as the chronicler's flourish or as the man's own. Either way, someone in that plaza thought it deserved writing down. Back across the ocean, in the very years young Luis was writing his notebooks, the Spanish tribunals stumbled into a different sort of panic. The machine pointed, this time, at an imaginary crime, and then, almost uniquely in this whole story, someone inside the machine pulled the brake. The setting is the Basque country, the mountains along the French border, around a village called Zugarramurdi, where a cave system opens out of a hillside above a stream. In 1608, a young woman named Maria de Chimildegui came home to the area after some years working in France, and she brought a story with her. Across the border, she said, she had attended the witches' Sabbath, and she'd seen neighbors from this side of the mountains there. She named a village wife, Maria de Chimildegui, as a fellow attendee. The accused woman denied it. The accuser recounted the gatherings in such convincing detail that the village believed her, and Maria de Chimildegui, under the pressure of her own family, broke down and confessed to being a witch, and immediately did what confessed witches everywhere did, and named others. Her elderly aunt, the aunt's circle. Within weeks, the village was consumed. Confessions describe the Acalare, the Sabbath, held in the meadow by the cave, the devil presiding in a black chair with a face beneath his tail that his servants kissed, feasts of exhumed corpses, toads dressed in little clothes serving as familiars, poisonous powders ground from dead men's brains, witches slipping through windows to suck the blood of sleeping children. Village children began saying witches carried them to the cave at night. Parents kept vigil, and children woke screaming that they'd been taken anyway. 2 of the accused elderly women died from the treatment their own neighbors and families gave them to force confessions, and the news moved down the mountain roads to the tribunal at Logroño. What gave the panic its lethal turn was the coincidence of the border, since on the French side, at that exact moment, a royal judge named Pierre de Lancre was running a full-blown witch hunt through the Basque province of Labourd, torturing and burning on a scale the Spanish tribunal never approached, convinced the entire Basque population was compromised. He wrote that the region's women were beautiful, the men were sailors, and the devil had found the mixture congenial. Refugees from his hunt streamed south over the passes carrying the terror with them, some of them accusers, some of them accused. The Logroño tribunal arrested an initial batch from Zugarramurdi, and the confessions in custody grew richer. These prisoners had been held for months among other prisoners, learning the expected story better with every retelling, until the investigation held around 300 names, with 40-odd shipped to Logroño for trial. An epidemic tore through the crowded cells while they waited, and more than a dozen of the accused died in prison. Among them an old woman from Renteria named Maria de Zozaya, who had confessed to decades of spectacular witchcraft with an eagerness her interrogators found gratifying, and whose death before sentencing solved nothing for her. Because you know by now how the tribunal handled escape by dying. The auto da fe at Logroño ran across 2 days, the 7th and 8th of November, 1610, and drew a crowd that contemporary accounts put around 30,000, pilgrims walking in from France for it, the largest public event that region had ever staged. 53 penitents in total, of whom about 30 were witchcraft cases. 18 who had confessed were reconciled and spared. 11 had refused to confess or had revoked, and for them the stage was set with a gallows load of effigies alongside the living. 6 human beings were burned alive at Logroño as witches, among them Gratiana Shara, an elderly widow who had spent her life running the Little Pilgrims Hospital at Urdax, washing travelers' feet on the road to Santiago. A man named Domingo de Subildegui, Maria de Arburu, Maria Bastan de la Borda, Maria de Echachute, Petri de Juangorena. Ordinary rural people, most of them old, every one of them protesting innocence of a crime that consisted of flying to a meadow and kissing the devil. 5 more were burned in effigy, their coffins of bones on the pyre beside the living, Maria de Zozayas among them. The sentences were narrated to the crowd in full, the corpse feasts, the toads, the powders, and the published account of the auto became a bestseller, spreading the Sabbath template across Spain, so that within months, new witch accusations were sprouting in villages that had never produced one before, in exactly the pattern of the stories everyone had just heard. One of the 3 inquisitors on that tribunal had voted against the executions, and his name deserves to be far better known than it is. Alonso de Salazar Frias, the junior of the 3, a canon lawyer in his 40s. Salazar had watched the trials assemble themselves out of coached testimony and cell block contagion, and when the Supreme Council in Madrid, itself uneasy, ordered a fresh visitation of the region with an edict of grace, Salazar took the assignment. He spent the better part of a year, 1611, on the roads of Navarre, and what he ran was, in effect, an audit of a mass delusion, conducted with a rigor nobody had thought to apply. He took the confessions of nearly 1,800 people, the large majority of them children and adolescents, since children had become the panic's main engine. He revisited confessed witches and let them recant in safety, and hundreds did, describing how they'd confessed under beatings from their own families or to end the questioning. He had midwives examine young women who claimed to have been carried to the Sabbath and given to the devil, and reported them physically untouched. He collected the jars of alleged flying ointments and demonic powders, had them tested on animals under observation, and watched nothing whatsoever happen. He cross-checked testimony against itself and found accusers placing the same person at Sabbaths in 2 locations on the same night, or at a Sabbath on a night the person could prove they'd spent elsewhere in front of witnesses. His reports back to Madrid run to hundreds of pages, and the sentences that survive from them are the coldest water in this entire story. Considering the matter with all Christian attention, he wrote, he had not found one single proof, nor even the faintest indication from which to infer that an act of witchcraft had actually occurred. And then the sentence that historians of the witch craze quote more than any other, his diagnosis of the whole mechanism. Neither witches nor bewitched existed in a village, he wrote, until people began talking and writing about them. The sermons announcing the crime were manufacturing the crime. Publicity was the pathogen. 3/4 of the accused, he noted, had been denounced by children. Madrid weighed Salazar's findings against his 2 furious senior colleagues, who accused him of everything short of witchcraft himself, and in 1614 the Suprema came down on Salazar's side, issuing new instructions that adopted his recommendations nearly whole. Witchcraft confessions were to be treated with systematic doubt. Corroboration was to be sought for external facts, accusations from children discounted, the edicts on witchcraft no longer published aloud, and a quiet detail with everything in it. The Sanbenitos from Logroño were not to be hung in the churches. The tribunal was declining to memorialize its own auto. Spain, the land of the Inquisition, effectively stopped executing witches from that point, generations before the courts of Germany, France, Scotland, and New England stopped. Hold that ledger up for a second. Secular and church courts across the rest of Europe and the colonies killed tens of thousands of accused witches in the 1600s, while the Spanish Holy Office, after 1610, killed approximately none. The institution, built on the premise that confession reveals truth, had run one controlled experiment on that premise, watched it fail, and filed the results. It never applied the lesson to itself. The same council that accepted Salazar's proof that torture and pressure generate false confessions went right on burning Judaizers convicted on confessions extracted by torture and pressure for another century and a half. The two files sat in the same archive. Portugal ran its own version of all this, and in some respects the Portuguese branch was the harsher franchise. The background there begins with a betrayal of the exiles of 1492, since tens of thousands of the Jews expelled from Spain that summer walked west into Portugal, paying an entry fee for what they were told was refuge. 5 years later, the Portuguese king, negotiating a Spanish marriage, agreed to expel them too, and then, calculating that he'd rather keep their skills and their taxes than lose them, chose a different cruelty: mass forced conversion. In 1497, the Jews of Portugal were, in effect, baptized as a population in scenes that included children being taken from parents to be raised Catholic, and dragged to the font conversions of adults who never consented to anything. Portugal thus instantly acquired an enormous new Christian population that had, unlike many Spanish conversos, never chosen conversion even nominally, and Lisbon showed what it thought of them in April of 1506. A dispute in a church, a new Christian was heard doubting a reported miracle, flared into a massacre that ran for days. Mobs, led in part by friars sweeping the city, dragging new Christian men, women and children from their houses, killing them in the streets, and burning the bodies, and sometimes the living, on pyres built in the Rocio Square. Contemporary estimates of the dead run from several hundred to a couple of thousand over 3 days. Sailors from ships in the harbour joined in for the looting. The king, to his credit, executed the ringleaders and punished the city. 30 years later, in 1536, the crown formally established a Portuguese Inquisition anyway, on the Spanish model, and its overwhelming business, even more than in Spain for its entire existence, was those same forcibly converted families and their descendants. Portuguese autos da fé ran regularly in Lisbon, Évora and Coimbra for 200 years, in the great riverside square in the capital, with the crowds and the ceremony you've already seen at Madrid. Something like 1,000 people or more went into Portuguese fires across those centuries, out of tens of thousands tried, and the flight of new Christian merchant families out of Portugal into Spain, ironically, and into Amsterdam, Bordeaux, Hamburg, the Ottoman lands, kept the Spanish tribunals supplied with victims and Europe supplied with a Sephardic diaspora whose descendants include a good chunk of early modern banking, medicine, and philosophy. Spinoza's family were refugees from the Portuguese Inquisition. So, in the 1730s, was Portugal's most popular comic playwright, Antonio José da Silva, a Lisbon lawyer whose puppet operas packed the theatres. Arrested with his family as a Judaizer, his mother had been tortured in his childhood. He himself had been tortured and reconciled once already, and you know what a second arrest meant. He was garroted and burned at a Lisbon auto in October of 1739. A tradition reports one of his plays was on the stage in the city around the very time he died. His audience that season included his judges. And Portugal did the thing empires do with their institutions. It shipped this one east. In 1560, a tribunal of the Holy Office opened in Goa, the capital of Portuguese India, with jurisdiction over Portuguese Asia and East Africa, an operating territory stretching from Mozambique to Macau, and by reputation, a reputation attested by Portuguese sources as well as foreign ones, it was the most feared branch of the entire system. Its stated targets were the usual new Christians who'd fled east to get away from the tribunals at home, plus a category unique to the colonies, converted Hindus suspected of backsliding into the religion of their birth. Around the tribunal grew a whole legal ecosystem of coercion, bans on Hindu ceremonies, on marriage rites, on cremation in the territories, temples destroyed by the hundreds, and a law under which orphaned Hindu children could be seized by the state and raised Catholic, with orphan defined generously enough that a living mother didn't necessarily disqualify you. The tribunal's headquarters occupied a former palace off the main square of Goa, a building the locals called simply the Big House, and mothers in Goa frightened children with its name for generations. Its trial records were almost entirely destroyed when the tribunal was finally abolished, a deliberate bonfire of the archive in the early 1800s, one last burning. So Goa is the branch we know least about from the inside. Surviving lists and indexes suggest on the order of 16,000 trials between 1560 and the end, with dozens burned in person and dozens more in effigy. And whatever those fragmentary numbers conceal, we happen to possess something better than statistics for this tribunal. A full-length insider account, written by a prisoner who survived it, got home to Europe, and published everything. Charles Delon was a young French physician, Catholic in his early 20s, working in the Portuguese enclave of Daman on the west coast of India in 1673. When he fell into a quarrel with the local governor, there was, naturally, a woman both men were interested in, and made the additional mistake of speaking his mind in company. Free-thinking table talk, roughly, skepticism about the veneration of images, some doubts about the efficacy of baptism as practiced, remarks about the Inquisition itself. A denunciation followed. He was arrested, chained, and eventually shipped down the coast to Goa in the hold of a vessel with other prisoners and delivered to the Big House, and his book, published in France in 1687, an immediate bestseller across Europe, translated everywhere, banned by the authorities whose conduct it described, takes you through the building room by room. The cells were small, windowless or nearly so, arranged along corridors built for surveillance, and the regime inside was silence. Total, enforced silence. Prisoners were forbidden to speak, to sing, to pray aloud, even to weep audibly, and Delon describes guards patrolling the corridors listening, and prisoners beaten in their cells for groaning. He learned the prison's geography by sound anyway. Everyone did. Coughs, the scrape of doors, the count of footsteps at feeding time, and, on occasion, screams from the interrogation rooms arriving muffled through masonry, so that every prisoner sat in the dark doing the same involuntary cartography. How far away is that? And when is it my turn? He describes the interrogations, always circling, always inviting him to confess without stating a charge. The same procedural trick you saw in Toledo, unchanged across a century and half the planet, since the manuals were the same manuals. He describes despair so total that he attempted his own death in the cell, was bled and nursed by the tribunal's physicians, and understood, as Luis de Carvajal had, that he was being repaired for the ceremony. And he describes the ceremony. In January of 1676, after more than 2 years inside, Delon walked in a Goa auto da fe in a San Benito, barefoot, holding an unlit candle among a couple of 100 penitents assembled from across Portuguese Asia, and watched at the end of it the small group wearing the flame-painted garments. At that auto, a handful of convicted men, including Hindus convicted of sorcery by some accounts, go to the fire while the assembly looked on. His own sentence: property confiscated, 5 years at the galleys, meaning 5 years chained to an oar. He served part of it in Portugal, where French connections and pure luck eventually pried him loose, and he went home and did the one thing the Holy Office could not forgive and could not prevent. He remembered everything, in order, with names, and put it in print. For the next century, when Europeans argued about the Inquisition, Delon's little book was on the table. Voltaire used it. The tribunals had spent 200 years perfecting the control of information inside their walls, and one talkative French doctor with a good memory undid a measurable amount of it from the outside for the price of a printing run. Italy, meanwhile, had revived its own version of the office, and the Roman Inquisition is the branch where this story intersects with names you already know. In 1542, with Protestantism spilling over the Alps and Italian intellectual circles passing Luther around under the table, Pope Paul III reorganized the old papal Inquisition into a permanent central congregation in Rome, the Holy Office, a standing committee of cardinals supervising tribunals across the Italian states. Compared to Spain, it killed far fewer people. The counts historians have assembled from Italian archives run to roughly 1,000+ executions across its centuries, against tens of thousands of trials, and its distinctive fixation, alongside Protestants and Judaizers, became books and ideas. The Index of Forbidden Books was its sibling institution, which means the Roman tribunal spent an unusual amount of its energy on people who thought for a living, and on a few who thought while grinding grain. Domenico Scandella, called Minocchio, was a miller in a village in the hills of Friuli, in the northeast, born in 1532. A talkative, sociable, argumentative man, a father of 11, sometime village mayor who had somehow taught himself letters and gotten hold of perhaps a dozen books over his lifetime, including a vernacular Bible, a medieval travel fantasy, and possibly, at some remove, a whisper of the Quran. Out of that pile, and his own restless milling of it, he built a personal cosmology, and he told it to everybody. The village later agreed he'd talk theology to anyone who stood still, on the road, in the tavern, at the mill while the wheel turned. His ideas, as the trial transcripts preserve them, are like nothing else in the century's records. In the beginning, he told his interrogators, all was chaos, and the elements churned together into a mass, the way cheese forms in milk. And in that cheese, worms appeared, as worms appear in cheese, and the worms were the angels. And the most powerful of the worms was God. Creation as fermentation. He thought Christ was a good man and a prophet, and no more. That the church's sacraments were merchandise. That every person could be saved in their own law, Turk and Jew included, a sentence of such casual tolerance that it must have chilled the tribunal more than the cheese did. A priest he'd quarrelled with denounced him, and in 1583 and 84, Menocchio stood trial before the Inquisition of Aquileia and answered questions with a fatal enthusiasm, expanding on his system, correcting his judges' misunderstandings of it, at one point remarking that he'd long wished for exactly this chance to explain himself to important churchmen. They gave him a lesson in what the chance cost. Condemned as a heresiarch, an inventor of heresies, he got prison and served 2 years of it before release on strict terms. The penitential garment, confinement to the village, silence. Silence held for a while. It could not hold. He was a man made of talk. Word of his relapse floated for years. Testimony describes him unable to stop, arguing scripture at the market, testing lines on strangers. And in 1599, old and worn, he was arrested a second time, and a relapsed heresiarch had only one exit. The final interrogations were pressed under torture. An old miller on the rope asked for accomplices, and the record shows him giving up nobody, insisting the heresies were his own manufacture, from his own head. Rome itself took an interest. The file went up the chain, and the order for his death is connected to the personal attention of the chief inquisitor of the age, Cardinal Bellarmine. Menocchio was burned at the stake in 1599. 400 years later, a historian named Carlo Ginzburg found the transcripts, wrote the book that made the miller famous, The Cheese and the Worms, and scholars have been arguing about him since. His judges recorded his cosmos in the act of destroying him, in the usual bargain of these archives, and the bargain, as usual, has a bitter kick. Everything we love about Menocchio, the voice, the worms, survives only because the questions were asked by men assembling a case to kill him. The chief inquisitor, whose attention reached down to crush a village miller, was simultaneously occupied that same year with a bigger fish in a cell in Rome. Giordano Bruno had been in the Holy Office's custody for 7 years by then, and his road there had crossed most of Europe. A Dominican friar from Nola, near Naples, brilliant and impossible, he'd fled his monastery around 1576, ahead of heresy proceedings, and spent a decade and a half as a wandering celebrity philosopher. Geneva, Toulouse, Paris, London, Wittenberg, Prague, lecturing on memory arts, quarrelling with every faculty that hosted him, and publishing a vision of the universe that still lands like vertigo, an infinite cosmos, no center, no edge, The stars, other suns, circled by other earths, carrying, he was willing to say, other inhabitants, all of it one infinite substance shot through with divinity. Copernicus, whom Bruno championed, had rearranged the solar system. Bruno dissolved the container. In 1591 he made the mistake his admirers still wince at. He accepted an invitation home to Italy, to Venice, from a young patrician named Giovanni Mocenigo, who wanted private lessons in the art of memory and seems to have expected something closer to magic. The lessons disappointed. The relationship curdled. In May of 1592, Mocenigo locked his house guest in an attic and summoned the Inquisition, delivering along with the philosopher a dossier of everything Bruno had said under his roof. Christ a magician, the Trinity impossible, the virgin birth absurd, worlds without number. Venice's tribunal handled him gently at first, and Bruno maneuvered, apologizing, distinguishing philosophy from faith. Then Rome demanded extradition, and Venice, after some proud haggling, handed him over, and the gates of the Roman Holy Office closed on him in 1593. They held him 7 years. The file of the trial mostly burned or vanished in the Napoleonic era. A summary survived, so the interrogations reach us in fragments, but the shape is clear. Years of sessions, propositions extracted from his books and demanded for retraction, Bruno yielding on scraps, then reclaiming ground, insisting to the end that his infinite universe was sound philosophy and no heresy, negotiating with men who held the fire in their pocket. Bellarmine drew up the final list of propositions. Bruno refused the full retraction. On the 8th of February, 1600, kneeling before the assembled cardinals, he heard himself declared an impenitent, pertinacious heretic, stripped of every clerical grade, and relaxed to the secular arm with the customary prayer for mercy without bloodshed. And it's at this moment that a witness, a Catholic one, writing to a friend, records the sentence that has followed the Inquisition ever since. Bruno rose from his knees and told his judges, "Perhaps you pronounce this sentence against me with greater fear than I receive it." 9 days he waited. On the morning of the 17th of February 1600, he was taken from the prison to the Campo dei Fiori, the Field of Flowers, a market square, and the records of the confraternity whose duty was comforting the condemned. They walked beside him in hoods, holding up images of the crucified Christ, chanting litanies. Note 2 details with their usual dispassion. His tongue was imprisoned, in their phrase, a gag, described in the sources as a wooden or leather device, by some accounts driven through with an iron spike pinning the tongue, because of the wicked words he would not stop producing. And at the very end, when the crucifix was held up to his face above the lit wood, he turned his head away. He was burned alive, the fire consuming, in the confraternity's words, his miserable and unhappy life, and his ashes went into the Tiber. Every book he'd written went on to the index. In 1889, over the Vatican's protest, the city of Rome raised a statue of him on the exact spot, the hooded figure that stands there now facing deliberately toward the Vatican, and the flower market goes on around his feet every morning. Rome's cells in those years held one more philosopher, and his case shows the tribunal's procedure meeting the one opponent it struggled with, a man willing to outsuffer it. Tommaso Campanella, another Dominican from the far south, had been arrested in 1599 for his part in a genuinely real conspiracy, a planned uprising in Calabria against Spanish rule, with Campanella as its prophet, aiming at a utopian republic timed to apocalyptic omens. Rebellion meant death, and heresy charges rode alongside, and Campanella, in a Naples cell, chose the single legal loophole available. The insane could not be executed for heresy, since a madman cannot be a heretic. So he went mad, deliberately, and stayed mad for years through every test. The authorities suspected the performance from the start, and the procedure for testing feigned madness was torture. The reasoning ran that no sane man would hold the pretense under sufficient pain. In June of 1601, they gave him the veglia, the waking, a specialty that combined the strappado with a seat of sharpened wood. The prisoner, arms wrenched in the ropes, could relieve the shoulder agony only by settling his weight onto spikes, and the apparatus rotated a man between two torments for as long as the sentence specified. Sleep made impossible by pain, pain made continuous by sleeplessness. Campanella's session lasted around 40 hours. Physicians attended in the usual way, monitoring the material. 40 hours on the veglia, and the friar raved, babbled nonsense, held the character without a crack, and at the end of it, the tribunal wrote down, in effect, that the madness must be genuine, since no one could have withstood that voluntarily. He'd beaten the manual with its own logic. He spent the next 27 years in prison, sane as a judge the entire time, and filled them with books. A utopia, the city of the sun, philosophy, poetry, astrological treatises for the very cardinals keeping him locked up, and in 1616, from his cell, of all the gestures in this story, a written defense of Galileo. Galileo's own collision with the Holy Office is the most famous trial in the history of science, and against the material we've been walking through, the physical facts of it are almost gentle, and the menace is in why they're gentle. Summoned to Rome in 1633 over his dialogue on the two world systems, he was lodged in comfortable apartments, never chained, never touched. What the record does contain is the examen rigorosum. At the decisive session, he was formally examined under the threat of torture. The standard escalation shown the possibility, with the Pope himself directing that it stop at the threat. A 69-year-old man, half the courts of Europe watching, and the tribunal's file against him running back to 1616, to a warning delivered personally by Bellarmine, the same hand on Bruno's file and Menocchio's. Galileo knew precisely what the institution threatening him had done to men who held their ground. Bruno's fire was living memory in the city where he was being questioned. He abjured. On his knees, in the white shirt of a penitent, he swore that he abhorred and detested the error of the earth's motion, and the tribunal gave him house arrest for life. And he went blind in his villa outside Florence, still working, dictating to students, and died there in 1642. And the sentence had achieved its actual purpose, since the point was never to hurt one old astronomer. The point was the audience. Descartes, in Holland, heard the news and pulled his own book on the world from publication, unprinted, and that, a book quietly strangled in a different country by a man the tribunal never met. is the truest measure of what all the fires had purchased. The system's finest work was always the work it never had to do. Roll back now to Spain in the 1550s, because while Rome was dealing with philosophers, the Spanish tribunals had discovered, to their genuine shock, Protestants at home, and the episode that followed produced one of the most terrible marriages in the whole archive. Small circles of Lutheran-leaning believers had formed in Seville and Valladolid, a few hundred people all told, monks, nuns, noblewomen, a celebrated court preacher named Agustín de Cazalla among them, and when the network cracked open in 1557 and 58, the state reacted as though it had found gunpowder under the throne. The aging emperor Charles V wrote from his retirement monastery, urging that heresy be treated as sedition and crushed without the usual mercies. The autos that answered him were the grandest Spain had yet staged. At Valladolid in May of 1559, before the regent and the court, 14 of the condemned went to the stake. Cazalla, broken and recanting, was garroted first, along with most of the others. One man walked past the mercy. Antonio Heresuelo, a lawyer from the town of Toro in his 30s, had confessed his Lutheran faith at once when arrested and never moved from it through every session, and at the stake he refused the crucifix, so he burned alive, and because he would not stop professing while he still had breath to profess with, he went to the fire gagged, the iron holding his tongue, able to burn but not to speak. An account passed down through the historians of the trial records, one of the guards being so unsettled by the man's composure in the flames that he ran him through with his halberd. Take that either as rage or as the only mercy anyone offered that day. And Heresuelo's execution is only half of his story. His wife, Leonor de Cisneros, was in the same procession. She was about 23, arrested with him, and under the fear of the fire she had done the human thing, recanted, accepted reconciliation, taken the San Benito and the prison term. The accounts say that as her husband passed her on the way to the stake, he looked at her once, said nothing. The gag settled that, and the look was reproach enough. She served her sentence with that look in her. Some years later, Leonor de Cisneros walked into the tribunal and revoked her recantation. She declared the faith she'd abandoned, knowing exactly, better than almost anyone alive, what the declaration purchased, and no persuasion moved her. The inquisitors spent months on her, since a young widow re-condemning herself unsettled even them. In September of 1568, at Valladolid, 9 years after her husband, she was burned alive at the same ground, unrecanting, and the file closed on the two of them. The second great Valladolid auto, in October 1559, was graced by the new king himself, Philip II, home from the north, and it gave Spanish history one of its most quoted exchanges. Among the condemned was an Italian-born nobleman, Carlos de Seso, once a trusted royal servant, and the chroniclers report that as he passed the royal box he called out to ask how the king could allow his servant to be treated so, to which Philip is said to have replied that if his own son were as wicked as de Seso, he would carry the wood to burn him himself. The line comes from chroniclers rather than a transcript, so give it the weight you give such things. What's beyond dispute is that the king watched de Seso burn alive that afternoon, gagged like Heresuelo. and that within a few years, the Protestant circles of Spain had ceased to exist. A movement that consumed Germany, France, England, and the Low Countries for a century was, in Spain, simply deleted, a few hundred people at a time, in about 5 years. If you ever wonder whether the terror worked on its own vicious terms, you have your answer. It worked. Seville's autos in that same purge produced a story that even the tribunal's own aftermath couldn't tidy. Maria de Bohorques, 21 years old, learned in Latin and scripture, one of the stars of the Seville Protestant circle, went to the stake at the Great Auto of September 1559, and the accounts describe her arguing theology with the friars assigned to convert her until they gagged her, and at the very end briefly freed to speak, reciting the creed with her own additions before the garrote took her. Under torture, in the sessions before the auto, she had been pressed for names, completeness always, and among the fragments extracted was that her half-sister Juana knew of her beliefs and had not denounced her. Juana de Bohorques was a married noblewoman, and she was heavily pregnant when the familiars came for her. She gave birth in the secret prison. The tribunal took the baby from her on the 8th day. About a week after that, her body barely knitted from the delivery, she was put to the cords, and the account that carried her story to Europe, written by Protestant exiles, so weigh its provenance, though the case's outline is accepted by the historians who've checked what can be checked, describes a session savage even by the chamber's standards, the ropes cutting to the bone, blood coming from her mouth, and internal injuries she did not recover from. She died in her cell days later. The tribunal then reviewed the file and declared her innocent, posthumously, of everything. A pregnant woman arrested for not informing on her sister, her newborn confiscated, tortured to death a week after childbirth, and acquitted. That sequence, in that order, is the procedure working precisely as written, every step of it lawful under the manuals, and no one was ever sanctioned for a moment of it. The same decade demonstrated that no altitude protected you, because in August of 1559, the Inquisition arrested the Archbishop of Toledo. Bartolomé de Carranza was the primate of all Spain, the highest churchman in the kingdom, a Dominican who had sat at the Council of Trent and ministered at the deathbed of Charles V, and his own catechism, plus the jealousy of the Inquisitor General and a rival theologian who combed his writings for propositions, was enough. Familiars took the archbishop from his bed at dawn in a small town outside Valladolid, and the primate of Spain went into the secret prisons like any grocer's wife, and stayed in confinement for very nearly 17 years. 7 in Spain, then a decade in Rome as popes and kings wrestled over the jurisdiction, while his case crawled through the machinery he had once helped supervise. The end, in 1576, was a compromise so exquisitely inquisitorial that it functions as a summary of the whole legal culture, not guilty of heresy, but made to abjure a list of suspicions of error, mildly penanced and released. He died 16 days later. 17 years of a man's life, the throne of Toledo held vacant with its revenues conveniently in escrow, for a verdict of, roughly, never mind. If the tribunals could do that to the Archbishop of Toledo, the lesson for everyone below him required no elaboration, and everyone below him took it. One more Spanish population belongs in this ledger, and their story bookends the conversos almost exactly. The Muslims of Spain had been promised their religion in the surrender of Granada in 1492, and the promise held for about 7 years before mass forced baptisms began. Granada's Muslims in 1502, Aragon's and Valencia's in the 1520s, creating the Moriscos, hundreds of thousands of new Christians who were, even more transparently than the conversos, nothing of the sort. Whole villages baptized by decree that had never seen the inside of a church since. The Inquisition inherited them as clientele, and Morisco cases flooded the tribunals of Valencia, Zaragoza, and Granada through the second half of the 1500s. And look at what the prosecutions were for. The charges map the reach all by themselves. Trials for refusing wine and pork, for couscous, for bathing. Regular washing was so associated with Islamic ritual that cleanliness itself functioned as evidence, and the files genuinely contain the accusation that the defendant was known to bathe. For dyeing with henna, for singing the old songs at weddings, for owning a paper with Arabic writing on it. An entire texture of ordinary life criminalized, and the galleys and the prisons, and sometimes the stakes receiving the convicted. After a brutal Morisco revolt in the mountains south of Granada in the 1560s was put down with massacre and mass enslavement, the crown's patience curdled into something colder, and between 1609 and 1614, Spain simply expelled the Moriscos altogether. On the order of 300,000 people marched to the ports and shipped mostly to North Africa, where chroniclers record thousands robbed and killed on the beaches by the locals they'd been dumped among, having been robbed first, efficiently, by the shippers. Morisco children under a certain age could be retained in Spain, taken from their parents at the docks to be raised Christian, and were. Spain thus closed the circle it had opened in 1492. Within 120 years, the peninsula that had been the most religiously plural corner of Western Europe for 8 centuries had amputated all 3 of its faiths but one, and the Inquisition had been the standing instrument of the whole operation. Not always the blade doing the cutting, but always the whetstone and the file cabinet, always the reason nobody dared object above a whisper. Now for the question everybody eventually asks about all of this, and the honest, complicated answer to it. How many people did the Inquisition actually kill? Before the numbers, one more inquisitor, the man who showed what the system produced when quality control failed completely. Diego Rodriguez Lucero took over the Tribunal of Córdoba in 1499, and within a few years he had converted it into an engine of pure fabrication. Witnesses were tortured into inventing synagogue meetings that never occurred, in houses chosen almost at random. Prisoners were coached, sometimes by professional perjurers kept for the purpose, to recite the same script about secret sermons and prophesying. And on those scripts, Lucero burned people in batches. One auto in December of 1504 sent scores to the fire in a single day, with estimates for his tenure running past 120 burned, many of them people whose Christianity nobody in Córdoba had ever doubted. He arrested members of the household of the saintly old Archbishop of Granada, a converso himself, and tried to build a case that the most respected churchman in Andalusia was running a secret synagogue. Córdoba's elite protested to the crown. Witnesses who recanted their coached testimony were tortured back into line. It took the death of Queen Isabella, years of appeals, and finally, in 1506, an armed uprising. The gentry and citizens of Córdoba stormed the Alcázar where the tribunal sat, broke open the cells, and released the prisoners before the system moved against him. And mark the manner of the moving: gently. A commission eventually found the accusations manufactured, the trials void, the dead innocent. Lucero was removed and retired to a comfortable canonry and died in his bed. Nobody was punished for the 100+ human beings burned on evidence the Inquisition's own review declared fictitious. The institution absorbed its worst scandal, admitted the error in a filing, compensated no one, and continued. Now, the count. For about 200 years, the loudest answer came from the institution's enemies, and it was enormous. The most influential single figure was published in 1817 by Juan Antonio Llorente, a priest who had actually been a secretary of the Inquisition and turned against it, taking his access to the archives with him into exile. His tally for Spain alone: nearly 32,000 burned in person, another 17 or 18,000 in effigy, roughly 290,000 otherwise penanced. Those numbers dominated the 19th century. Then scholars started actually counting, file by file, and the archive pushed back on its own legend. The Spanish tribunals, from the 1540s onward, sent annual case summaries to the Supreme Council, the Relaciones de Causas, and those reports survive in bulk. And in the 1970s and 80s, two historians, Gustav Henningsen and Jaime Contreras, sat down and tabulated them. Roughly 44,674 trials between 1540 and 1700 across the whole empire. Of those, about 826 people executed in person and 778 in effigy. Under 2% of verdicts ending at the stake. Add the early period, the terrible 1480s through 1520s, before systematic reporting, the decades of Torquemada and Lucero, when the great majority of the killing happened, and the working estimates most specialists now use put the Spanish Inquisition's full body count somewhere in the low thousands across 3.5 centuries, with figures like 3,000 to 5,000 appearing most often. Portugal adds its 1,000+. Rome adds its 1,000+. For comparison, the secular and Protestant courts of Europe killed somewhere between 40 and 60,000 accused witches in a fraction of that time, and single massacres like St. Bartholomew's Day in France consumed more lives in a week than the Spanish tribunals took in their worst decade. None of that comparison is offered to shrink what you've been listening to for the past 2 hours. Look hard at what the revised numbers actually describe. An institution that killed thousands, tortured tens of thousands, imprisoned and ruined hundreds of thousands, marked their descendants for centuries. and did it all so slowly and procedurally, wrapped in such perfect paperwork that the total climbed for 350 years without any single year looking like an atrocity. The horror doesn't shrink when the number does, it changes shape. A mob kills more people faster. A mob also exhausts itself. This never got tired. The gap between the legend's numbers and the archive's numbers has its own history, and it's tangled up with a propaganda war the Inquisition thoroughly earned. Spain in the 1500s was the superpower, at war with Protestant England and the rebellious Dutch, and its enemies had printing presses. In 1567, a book appeared out of Heidelberg under the name Reginaldus Gonsalvus Montanus, almost certainly a pseudonym for one or more Spanish Protestant exiles who had passed through the Seville tribunal's hands, laying out the Holy Office's methods for a European audience, the secret prisons, the anonymous witnesses, the tortures, the autos. It was translated into English, French, Dutch and German within a few years and became the foundation of the Inquisition's international image for centuries, alongside Fox's Book of Martyrs and a river of Dutch revolt pamphlets, engravings of dungeon scenes included. Set Montanus beside the actual trial records his author never expected anyone to check, as modern scholars have, and something surprising happens. The procedure he describes, the sequence, the chamber protocol, holds up remarkably well. The exaggerations pile up at the edges, in the implication that every prisoner was tortured, that the fires never paused, that Spain itself was one vast dungeon. The core mechanism, everything you've heard today from the tribunal's own transcripts, needed no inflation. Later centuries did the inflating anyway, and by the 1800s the popular Inquisition had accumulated a museum's worth of properties the files don't show. You've seen the props, the spiked cabinet shaped like a woman that folds shut on its victim. The paper trail on the famous one begins around 1793, when a German scholar described such a device, and the celebrated example toured the world's fairs until an Allied bomb destroyed it at Nuremberg in 1944. Nothing like it appears in any inquisitorial record anywhere. The little pear-shaped implement said to expand hideously inside the body. It surfaces in collectors' catalogues in the 1800s, and surviving examples mostly can't do what the placards claim. Set those objects beside what the notarized records actually contain, session after session, tribunal after tribunal, century after century, rope, water, a pulley, a trestle, a jar, a torturer on salary, a doctor on call, a clerk writing down the screams. The reality was cheaper than the props, quieter than the props, and worse than the props. Because the props are fiction you can walk away from, and Elvira del Campo is not. Which returns us on the way to the end to that island church where we began, because the sacks on the walls of Palma de Mallorca have a specific catastrophe behind them. Mallorca's converso community, the ancestors of the Xuetas, had survived quietly for generations, marrying among themselves, keeping fragments of the old faith in a few families, tolerated as long as nobody looked hard. In 1688, Frightened by a fresh round of investigations, several dozen of them attempted the only exit remaining and boarded an English ship by night to escape the island. The weather turned. The ship couldn't clear the harbor, the passengers were noticed, and the attempted flight, as the tribunals had held since Seville, was itself proof, handed the tribunal an entire community in one sweep. The trials ran 3 years. In 1691, across a series of autos on the island, some 36 people were relaxed in person, most accepting the garrote at the end. 3 did not. Raphael Valls, the spiritual anchor of the community, and 2 siblings, Raphael Benito Tarongi and his sister Catalina, refused conversion at the stake and burned alive. And we know how it looked in ugly close-up, because a Jesuit named Francisco Garau, who watched from the good seats, published a triumphant account of the ceremonies. He called the book The Triumphant Faith, and in it he described with satisfaction how the fat of Vals's body caught, and how the man burned, in Garau's phrase, like something at a roast splitting open in the heat, and how young Catalina screamed in the fire that she was burning, as though, Garau notes with something like a sneer, that were news. That pamphlet was reprinted on the island for 2 centuries. Reprinted, as in Mallorcan readers kept buying a gloating eyewitness description of their neighbors' ancestors splitting open in a fire, and the 15 surnames of the condemned stayed on the sacks in the church of Santo Domingo, renewed and legible, into the 1820s, and the descendants stayed a shunned caste into the 20th century. And when the Balearic Parliament and Jewish organizations held ceremonies of apology and remembrance for the burnings, the year on the programs was 2011, 320 years from the fire to the apology. The men who painted the San Benitos would have considered that a system functioning exactly as designed. After Mallorca, the fires grew rarer, though one last convulsion was still coming. In the 1720s, under a new dynasty, the Spanish tribunals ran a final coordinated campaign against surviving crypto-Jewish families, hundreds of trials in a decade, and several dozen more human beings went to the stakes in the last mass burnings on Spanish soil, a generation that included great-grandchildren of people penanced in the 1500s, the files still cross-referenced, the old family folders reopened one final time. Then the 18th century settled over Spain, and the Holy Office aged into something stranger, a censorship bureau with a dungeon attached. Its energy went into the Index, into hunting French books, into prosecuting Enlightenment-minded officials for owning Voltaire and Rousseau, the royal reformer Pablo de Olavide, penanced in 1778 for exactly that, became a European celebrity victim, proof to the salons of Paris that Spain still kept the old beast fed. The stakes themselves nearly went cold. Nearly. In August of 1781, in Seville, the tribunal that had opened the whole Spanish story 3 centuries earlier closed the burning chapter of it with one of the saddest files in the entire archive. Maria de los Dolores Lopez was a blind woman in her mid-30s, a beata, one of the freelance holy women of the era, who claimed visions, conversations with heaven, and intimacy with the divine, and who had been, since childhood, passed among confessors, at least one of whom had made her his mistress. Her claims curdled into a charge of demonic pact. Theologians spent months trying to talk her out of her visions. She held to them, blind and alone against the last inquisitorial tribunal in Europe still willing to kill, and on the day, accounts describe her finally breaking down at the stake as the friars pressed her, or being executed still constant depending on the source. She was garroted before the fire, and her body burned on the Seville meadow where the Quemadero's foundations had stood since 1481. The institution's first fire, and its last one, in the same city, 300 years apart, and the final person it burned was a blind woman whose visions would, in another century, have gotten her a doctor instead of a stake. Killing the institution itself took another half-century and a foreign army. When Napoleon's forces took Madrid, his brother Joseph, installed as king, abolished the Inquisition by decree in December of 1808, and French officers made a point of throwing open tribunal buildings as they went. The liberation of the dungeons became a set piece of Napoleonic propaganda, complete with lurid prints. The free Spanish Parliament at Cadiz, no friend of the French, reached the same conclusion from the opposite direction and voted the Holy Office out of existence in 1813, after debates in which Spanish liberals said out loud, for the first time in 3 centuries on Spanish soil, what the institution had cost the country. Then Ferdinand VII came back from captivity in 1814, tore up the constitution, and restored the Inquisition with the rest of the old order, and the tribunals creaked back to life, older and poorer, chasing Freemasons and liberals now more than heretics. A revolution in 1820 abolished it a third time, and in that round the crowds of Madrid and Barcelona stormed the tribunal palaces to free the prisoners of conscience inside, and the scenes disappointed everyone. The mobs burst into the famous secret prisons expecting hollow-eyed multitudes, and found a handful of bewildered inmates and room after room of paper, files, shelves and shelves of the real weapon. Some of the crowd, the story goes, went home with armfuls of confiscated books instead of rescued martyrs. When Ferdinand clawed back absolute power in 1823 with a French royalist army, he somehow never got around to formally restoring the Holy Office. Even the European reaction had its limits by then, but he permitted something almost worse for being smaller. Local juntas de fe, boards of faith, diocesan committees that carried on the old business at retail. And one of them, in Valencia, produced the last file of the entire story. Cayetano Ripoll was a schoolmaster, born around 1778, a quiet man by every surviving account. As a young soldier, he'd been captured in the war against Napoleon and spent years as a prisoner in France, and he came home changed in the most dangerous way available to a man of his time and place. He'd done some thinking. In France, he had encountered deism, the spare, undecorated belief in a creator God, arrived at by reason, without churches, without dogma, without intermediaries, and it had settled into him and stayed. Back in Valencia, he took a post teaching children in a small school, and he taught them, by the testimony gathered against him, honesty and charity and the existence of God, while quietly omitting the rest. He didn't take his pupils to Mass. Former students, questioned later, could point to nothing sinister. A teacher who was kind to them, who drilled them on their letters and their duties to their neighbor, and who simply left certain words out of the morning routine. The gap where those words should have been was the crime, He was heard to substitute, for the customary praise of the sacrament, the phrase "Praise be to God," and in some tellings the schoolroom's walls carried the words "Praise be to reason." Somebody, inevitably, denounced him. This was 1824, in the white heat of the Restoration, and the Junta de Fe of Valencia took the case and held the schoolmaster in prison for nearly 2 years while it processed him with the old patience. He never recanted. The record of his final position is simple and, after everything you've heard today, almost unbearably familiar. He believed in God. He did not believe the rest, and he would not say otherwise to save his life. The junta convicted him of teaching deist principles and handed him to the civil power, and on the 26th of July, 1826, while London had gas lighting and steam presses, while the first railways were being surveyed, within the lifetimes of people who would live to see photographs, Cayetano Ripoll was taken out and hanged in Valencia. Spanish law no longer permitted burning a man for heresy, and the old rule said a heretic's remains belonged to the fire, so the authorities squared the circle with a piece of theatre that stands as the institution's true final signature. His body was placed inside a barrel, and on the barrel they painted flames. Painted flames. 6 centuries after Minerve, 4 centuries after Torquemada, the fire that had consumed the Cathars in their gorge and the Carvajals in their plaza, and Bruno in his flower market had shrunk to a decoration on a piece of cooperage, and they buried him in it, in unconsecrated ground, a schoolteacher whose crime was believing in God slightly too simply. His reported last words, "I die reconciled to God and to man." The execution scandalized Europe. Newspapers across the continent carried it as an atrocity from a museum. Governments protested, and even in Spain the embarrassment was heavy enough that no junta ever tried another capital case. 8 years later, on the 15th of July, 1834, the regent Maria Cristina signed the decree that abolished the Spanish Inquisition finally and completely, 356 years after the bull of 1478. Portugal had shut its version in 1821. Goa's big house had already been closed and its archive burned. The Roman Holy Office survives to this day as a Vatican department, renamed twice into something with doctrine in the title instead. The aftermath scattered in every direction, and a few pieces of it carry all the way into the present, so follow them before we close. The Spanish tribunal's archives, those millions of pages, met the fate of all suddenly worthless empires of paper. Some collections were carted to Madrid and preserved, some were looted, and some, this is documented, and it physically hurts, were sold off by weight as scrap, so that in certain Spanish towns in the 1800s, shopkeepers wrapped fish and cheese in torture transcripts. What survived, though, survived spectacularly, and the irony of this whole subject is that the Inquisition's meticulousness became the instrument of its own exposure. Everything we know that damns it, it wrote down about itself. In 1998, the Vatican opened the Roman Holy Office's archives to researchers, and in the year 2000, John Paul II stood in St. Peter's and asked forgiveness for the use of violence in the service of truth, the closest the institution's parent has come to a verdict on its own creation. Spain, for its part, passed a law in 2015 offering citizenship to the descendants of the Jews expelled in 1492, and tens of thousands of families applied. some of them still speaking Ladino, some of them producing, for the cameras, the iron keys to houses in Toledo and Seville that their ancestors locked behind them in the summer of the expulsion and carried through 5 centuries of exile, passed down with the story attached. This opens a door in Spain, and in the Toledo archive, in its folder, the transcript of Elvira del Campo is still there. You can request it. Scholars handle it with cotton gloves. The paper has gone brown at the edges, and the ink has faded to the color of dried blood, and partway down the page, in a clerk's disciplined hand, unchanged in 450 years, a woman is asking the men around her to please tell her what she has to say. The men are 4.5 centuries dead. The institution is dead. The question is still sitting there on the page, unanswered, about as close to a verdict as this story will ever get, and it was written by the Inquisition's own employee, on the Inquisition's own paper, at the Inquisition's own request. And that's where I'm going to stop. This one was heavy, I know. They're not all going to be like this, but this one had to be. If you made it the whole way through, you're my favorite type of person, and the comments are yours. Tell me what stuck with you, or just tell me you survived it. Massive thanks as always to the Patreon crew and the YouTube members who fund these deep dives. If you'd like to help decide what we cover next and keep this thing independent, the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Sleep well. See you in the next one.